The wind on the high plains did not just blow, it scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of empty country, searching for any crack in a wall or a spirit to work its way inside. Eleanor Hart, known to the few souls in Dry Creek as Nell, felt that wind pushing against her back as she hauled the water bucket up from the muddy trickle of the creek. The handle bit into her palms. Her hands were raw, the skin chapped red and splitting near the knuckles, looking like the hands of a woman 3 times her age. She was only 20. She paused for a moment, setting the heavy pail down in the brittle, yellow grass that crunched under her boots. She looked out at the horizon. It was a terrifyingly wide line where the pale blue sky met the brown earth, broken only by a distant, jagged ridge of low hills that looked like the spine of some buried beast. The sky felt too big. It pressed down on her, vast and indifferent, making her feel small, trapped in the center of a circle that never ended. She picked up the bucket again, the water sloshing against the rim, soaking the hem of her calico dress, which was already stained with the reddish mud of the bank. She walked toward the shack that sat slumped against the wind about a quarter-mile out from the town proper. It was a sagging collection of gray boards and tin that groaned whenever the wind picked up. It was the only home she had, though calling it a home felt like a lie. It was just a place where she slept and tried to keep her father from drinking himself into a grave. Silas Hart had been a good man once, or so she told herself to keep the bitterness from choking her. But the whiskey and the cards had eaten that man away, leaving a hollow shell that rattled with empty promises and bad debts. As Nell approached the door, the sound of voices stopped her. She froze, the bucket heavy in her hand. There were strange horses tied to the rail, 2 of them, rode hard and looking mean. Inside, her father's voice was high and thin, a sound she associated with his worst desperate moments. "Please, you have to give me another week," Silas was pleading. "The cards turned on me. Just bad luck. Bad luck is a man's own making," a deeper, rougher voice answered. The voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "You're out of time. Hart, we want the money, or we take the hide." "I have something," Silas stammered. "I have something of value. I just need time to arrange the sale." Nell stepped closer to the rough-hewn wall, pressing her ear against a gap in the wood. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. "You have nothing but a dry well and a lame horse," the second stranger said. "I have a daughter," Silas said. His voice trembled, but the words were clear. "She is young, strong. She can cook, she can work. There are men in this town who are lonely. Men with money." Nell felt the blood drain from her face. The bucket slipped from her fingers, hitting the dirt with a dull thud, water splashing over her boots. Inside, the silence stretched. "You talking about a trade?" the first man asked, his tone shifting from aggression to a dark curiosity. "I am talking about a settlement," Silas said, desperation making him talk fast. "A bride auction. I heard them talking about it down at the Golden Steer. I can put her up. The highest bidder covers my marker." Nell backed away, her hands trembling. Her stomach knotted so tight she thought she might be sick right there in the weeds. They were talking about her as if she were a heifer or a spare saddle. The door creaked open before she could run. 2 men stepped out, dusty and grim. They looked at her, one with a flat, dead stare, the other with a slow, appraising grin that made her skin crawl. They didn't say a word to her. They just mounted their horses and rode toward town, leaving the dust to settle on her skin. She walked inside. Silas was sitting at the rough table, a half-empty bottle of brown liquor in front of him. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "What did you do?" Nell asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Silas took a long pull from the bottle. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "It is for the best. Nell, it is a chance for you." "A chance," she repeated, her voice rising. "You offered to sell me. I am arranging a marriage," Silas snapped, finally looking at her. His eyes were watery and bloodshot, full of a terrified defiance. "A proper match. You will have a roof over your head that does not leak. You will have food. You are paying your debts with my life," Nell said. She felt a strange separation from her body, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. The panic was there, hot and sharp, but beneath it was a heavy, cold resignation. She had known, deep down, that it would come to this. He had gambled away the furniture, her mother's locket, and the horse. She was the only thing left. "It is done," Silas said, slamming the bottle down. "Tonight, at the saloon, you put on your best dress. You look pleasant. If you do not, those men come back, and they will not be looking for a wedding. They will be looking for blood." The sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon, painting the clouds in bruises of purple and red. When Caleb Rourke rode his gelding past the weathered fence of the town cemetery, he was a man built for the wind and the work, broad-shouldered and lean. He sat his saddle with the easy grace of someone who spent more time on a horse than on his own feet. His hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over a face that was more interesting than handsome. Sharp cheekbones, a nose that had been broken once, and eyes the color of flint. He pulled on the reins, bringing the horse to a halt. He looked toward a small corner of the graveyard where the grass was kept cut back. A simple wooden cross stood there, weathered gray by 5 winters. He didn't ride in. He didn't need to read the name to know who lay there. Sarah. She had been 18. The memory of the fire, the smell of smoke, and the sound of the men who had burned them out, men who took what they wanted because they had the money and the guns to do it, twisted in his gut like a rusted knife. "Rest easy, little one," he murmured to the wind. He nudged the horse forward. He had cattle to sell, a small herd he had driven in from his place 2 days north. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy the lumber he needed to fix the barn roof and maybe enough wire to fence off the southern pasture. Dry Creek was not much of a town. It was a scar of civilization on the face of the wild, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings that looked like they were leaning away from the wind. He rode to the livery stable first, negotiating a fair price for the boarding of his horse with the stable master, a man with one eye and no patience. From there, Caleb walked to the general store. The boardwalk thumped hollowly under his boots. He needed coffee, flour, and a new cinch for his saddle. The store smelled of sawdust, pickled eggs, and dried leather. 2 men were leaning against the counter, chewing tobacco and laughing low in their throats. "You going to the show tonight?" one of them asked, spitting a stream of brown juice into a brass spittoon. "I would not miss it," the other replied. "Old Man Hart is finally cashing in his last chip, selling that girl of his to the highest bidder." Caleb froze, his hand hovering over a sack of beans. He turned slowly. "What did you say?" Caleb asked. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that cut through the store's stillness. The men looked at him. One of them, a heavy-set man with a grease-stained vest, shrugged. "Just town business. Stranger. Silas Hart is auctioning his daughter off at the saloon, calling it a bride auction, but we all know what it is. He owes money all over town." Caleb felt a tightness clamp down on his jaw. A bride auction. It was a polite way of saying slavery. It was a polite way of saying a woman was being traded like livestock to cover a drunkard's mistake. "Who is buying?" Caleb asked. The man laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Everyone. But my money is on Rex Mallory. He has had his eye on the girl for a year. He likes them young and scared. The name Mallory landed hard." Caleb knew the type. Every town had a Mallory, a man who owned the sheriff, owned the bank, and thought he owned the people too. Caleb turned back to his supplies, his movements mechanical. He paid the clerk, counting out the coins with steady fingers. But inside, a cold fire was starting to burn. He thought of Sarah. He thought of how she had looked at him, terrified, before the end. He hated bullies. He hated men who preyed on the weak because they thought no one would stand in their way. He picked up his supplies and walked out. The sun was gone now. The street was filling with shadows, and down at the end of the road, the windows of the saloon glowed yellow and sickly. Men were moving toward it like moths to a flame. He told himself to get on his horse and ride out. It was not his business. He had a ranch to run and ghosts of his own to keep quiet. But his feet didn't move toward the livery. They moved toward the light and the noise. The saloon was hot. The air was thick enough to chew, heavy with the stinging haze of tobacco smoke, the sour reek of spilled whiskey, and the sharp copper tang of unwashed bodies. It was packed wall to wall. Caleb found a spot near a support post in the back, obscured by the shadows. He pulled his hat brim down, watching. At the front of the room, a space had been cleared. A table had been pushed aside, and a single wooden chair sat there. Silas Hart stood by the bar, looking pale and sweating profusely. He was drinking fast, his hands shaking so hard the glass clicked against his teeth. Then, the back door opened. A hush rippled through the room, followed by a low, collective murmur that made Caleb's hands curl into fists. Nell walked in, or rather, she was pushed. She wore a faded blue dress that had been scrubbed clean but was threadbare at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face that was pale as milk. She looked terrified, but she held her chin up. Her eyes, however, were dull, glazed over with a shock that looked dangerously close to breaking. She sat in the chair. She didn't look at the crowd. She stared at a spot on the floorboards, her hands gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles were white. A man in a striped suit, the auctioneer, stepped up. He had a smile that showed too many teeth. "Gentlemen," he boomed, "we have a unique opportunity tonight. Silas Hart offers the hand of his daughter, Eleanor, in lawful marriage. The highest bidder takes the contract and the lady." Laughter rippled through the room. Someone shouted, "Turn her around, let us see the teeth." Caleb felt a muscle twitch in his cheek. He watched Nell. She didn't flinch. It was as if she had left her body behind and retreated to some small, safe place deep inside her mind. The bidding opened at $50. "50!" shouted a miner near the front. "75!" called a rancher from the valley. "100!" The numbers climbed. The men were shouting, jeering, making comments that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with possession. They discussed her hips, her mouth, her strength. Rex Mallory stepped out from a private booth. The room quieted down. Mallory was a sleek man, dressed in a black suit that cost more than Caleb's entire herd. He had cold, reptilian eyes and a silver-tipped cane. $300, Mallory said. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. The room murmured. 300 was a year's wages for most men there. 350, said a wealthy cattleman named Garrett. 400, Mallory countered instantly, staring Garrett down. Nell flinched, just once. Her father had walked over to her, whispering something in her ear, likely telling her to smile. She pulled away from him, a tiny, jerky movement of revulsion. Caleb saw it. He saw the terror behind the mask. He saw the way she was trying to make herself disappear. Something inside him snapped. It was the same thing that had broken the night his sister died. It was the absolute refusal to watch one more innocent thing be devoured by the wolves. 450, Garrett yelled, though he looked uncertain. $500, Mallory said, turning to the crowd with a smirk, and I will buy a round for the house. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $500 to Mr. Mallory, going once. Nell closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, tracking through the dust on her cheek. $1,000. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned. Caleb stepped out of the shadows. He stood tall, his boots planted wide, his face unreadable. The auctioneer blinked. Did you say 1,000? Sir. Caleb didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked straight at Mallory. $1,000, gold. The silence was absolute. $1,000 was a fortune. It was the price of a small ranch, a herd, a new life. It was everything Caleb had saved for 5 years. It was the money for the barn, the fence, the future. Mallory's face turned a mottled red. He looked at Caleb, sneering. "Who is this saddle tramp? You do not have that kind of money. Boy." Caleb reached into his coat. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch and dropped it on the table near the auctioneer. The heavy thud of gold coins echoed in the quiet room. "Count it," Caleb said. The auctioneer opened the bag. His eyes widened. "It is all here." Mallory looked at the bag, then at Caleb. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't going to pay over $1,000 for a girl, no matter how much his pride stung. He spat on the floor and turned away. "Too rich for my blood. She is not worth half that." "Sold!" the auctioneer yelled, slamming his hand down on the table. "Sold to the stranger in the back." Silas Hart scrambled forward, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of relief and naked greed. He reached for Caleb's hand, shaking it vigorously. "A fine bargain, sir! A fine bargain! You are getting a good worker, an obedient girl." Caleb did not shake the hand. He looked at Silas with a disgust so profound that the older man withered and stepped back. "Sign the paper," Caleb said coldly. Silas signed the debt transfer and the marriage contract with shaking hands. He grabbed the bag of gold, clutching it to his chest like a child with a doll. Caleb walked over to the chair. Nell looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a horror that pierced him. She was looking at him as if he were a monster. To her, he must be. Only a monster would pay $1,000 for a human being. "Come with me," Caleb said. He didn't touch her. He didn't grab her arm like the other men would have. He just turned and walked toward the back door. Nell stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she followed him. She had no choice. She was his property now. The alley behind the saloon was dark and cold. The wind whistled between the buildings, smelling of sagebrush and coming rain. The noise of the saloon faded to a dull roar behind them. Caleb stopped near a water trough. He turned to face her. Nell backed up until she hit the rough wood of the saloon wall. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. She waited for him to give an order. She waited for him to touch her. She waited to find out what kind of hell she had been sold into. Caleb took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. He looked tired. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper, the contract Silas had signed. He held it up in the moonlight so she could see it. Then he tore it in half, then in quarters. He opened his hand and let the pieces of paper flutter away in the wind, disappearing into the mud and the dark. "You do not owe me a thing," Caleb said. His voice was low and steady. "You can walk away right now. You are free." Nell stared at him. She stared at the empty air where the paper had been. She couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense in the language of her life. "What?" she whispered. "I bought the debt," Caleb said. "I did not buy you. Nobody can buy a person, no matter what your father thinks." Nell let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. "You expect me to believe that? You spent $1,000. $1,000! Men do not spend that kind of money for charity. I am not asking you to believe me," Caleb said. "I am telling you the truth. Walk away. Go wherever you want." "Where?" Nell cried out, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "Where am I supposed to go? I have no money. I have no horse. My father just sold me. If I stay in this town, do you think Mallory will leave me alone? He will just take what he could not buy." She was shaking with fury, stepping toward him. "You are playing a game. You want me to be grateful? You want me to fall on my knees? Just tell me what you want and stop lying to me." Caleb stood still, taking her anger. He knew he deserved it. simply for being a man in a world that treated her this way. "I want nothing from you," he said. "Then why?" she demanded. "Why did you do it?" "Because I could," Caleb said simply. He looked down at his boots, then back at her. "Listen to me. I have a ranch 2 days' ride north of here. It is quiet. It is hard work. I was saving that money to expand, to hire hands." He took a breath. "I can walk you to the stagecoach office right now. I have enough coin left in my pocket to buy you a ticket to Denver or St. Louis. You can leave tonight. Or, if you have nowhere else, you can come with me." Nell went silent. She watched him. He wasn't moving toward her. He kept his hands where she could see them. "Come with you?" she repeated softly. "As an employee," Caleb said firmly. "I need help. Cooking, mending, tending the garden. I will pay you a fair wage. You will have your own room, a lock on the door, and you can leave whenever you choose. No strings, no debts." Nell looked at him, searching for the lie. She looked for the leer, the cruelty she saw in Mallory's eyes, the weakness she saw in her father's. She saw only a tired man with a scar on his soul who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but here. She looked down the alley toward the main street. She could hear Mallory's men shouting. If she stayed here, she was dead or worse. If she took a stagecoach to a city she didn't know, with $5 in her pocket, she would starve. She looked back at Caleb. "Why?" she asked again, her voice smaller this time. Caleb put his hat back on, shadowing his eyes. "Because I had a sister once," he said, "and no one helped her." The wind gusted, blowing dust between them. Nell felt the cold seep into her bones. She didn't trust him. She couldn't afford to trust him. But she believed, just a little, that he might be the only safe harbor in a storm that was about to swallow her whole. "I will ride with you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But if you ever try to touch me, if you ever try to claim what you paid for, I will kill you." Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't mock her threat. "That is a fair deal," he said. They rode out an hour before dawn. The town of Dry Creek was silent, a collection of dark shapes huddled against the vastness of the plains. Nell rode a mare Caleb had bought from the livery, paid for with the last of his trade money. She wore a heavy wool coat he had given her, too big in the shoulders, smelling of cedar and horse. The wind cut through their clothes, sharp and biting. The sky was a deep, bruised indigo, the stars fading as the gray light of morning began to bleed up from the east. As they reached the ridge that marked the edge of the town's reach, Nell turned in the saddle. She looked back at the faint yellow lights of the saloon, still burning. She thought of her father, probably passed out with his bag of gold, dreaming of a fortune he would lose in a week. She felt a surge of terror so strong it almost made her turn the horse around. She was riding into the empty wilderness with a stranger. She was leaving the only life she had ever known. But then she looked forward. The prairie opened up before them, endless and wild. There were no fences here, no debts, no gavels banging down on a table. She looked at Caleb's back. He rode straight, not looking behind him. She nudged her horse forward, following him into the gray light. It was terrifying, but for the first time in her life, the terror was her own choice. She took a breath of the cold, clean air, and rode on. The dawn broke over the high plains not with a gentle warmth, but with a cold, revealing light that stripped the shadows from the earth. The sun crawled up over the edge of the world, bleeding pale gold across a landscape that seemed to go on forever. For Eleanor Hart, riding a mare that smelled of strange sweat and old leather, the sunrise revealed just how small they truly were. They had been riding for hours, putting the wretched town of Dry Creek behind them. The silence between them was not peaceful. It was a heavy, physical thing, weighted down by the memory of the night before. Nell rode 10 paces behind Caleb Rourke, her eyes fixed on the back of his canvas coat. She was exhausted, her body aching from the tension of holding herself rigid in the saddle, but she refused to complain. To complain was to show weakness, and she had learned that weakness was the scent that drew the wolves. The land here was different from the scrubby outskirts of town. It was vast, undulating like a frozen sea of brown grass and brittle sage. Dried-up creek beds cut through the earth like scars, and in the distance, flat-topped buttes rose up against the sky, ancient and indifferent. It was terrifying in its emptiness. There was nowhere to hide here. But as the wind whipped her hair across her face, Nell realized there was also a strange cleanliness to it. The air didn't smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. It smelled of dust, dry pine, and distance. Caleb slowed his horse near a stand of cottonwoods that marked a trickling stream. He swung down from the saddle with a groan of leather and stiff joints, then looked back at her. He didn't order her down. He just stood there, holding his horse's reins, waiting. "We should water the horses," he said. His voice was rough, unused to speaking. Nell nodded and slid down. Her legs nearly buckled when her boots hit the hard ground, but she grabbed the stirrup leather to steady herself. She led her mare to the water, keeping the animal between herself and the man. They ate a simple meal of dried beef and hard biscuits Caleb had in his saddlebags. They sat on opposite sides of the small clearing. Nell ate quickly, her eyes darting around the horizon, expecting riders to appear on the ridge, expecting Mallory, expecting her father. Caleb watched the water moving over the stones. He took a bite of the biscuit and chewed slowly. He could feel her fear radiating off her like heat from a stove. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but he knew words were cheap. He had bought her. That was the fact that hung between them like a loaded gun. No matter what he said about freedom, the transaction had happened. "We have another day of riding," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "The ranch is north, past the twin sisters' buttes." Nell looked up, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Is it far?" 20 miles, maybe 30. Caleb answered. "The horses are tired. We will take it slow." He stood up and dusted off his trousers. He moved to check the cinch on her saddle. Nell flinched, stepping back quickly. Caleb froze, his hands suspended in the air. He looked at her, seeing the way her shoulders hunched, the way her hand went to her side as if reaching for a weapon she didn't have. "I am just checking the tack." "Nell," he said softly, "I do not want you slipping off if the belly band loosens. I can do it," she said. Her voice was sharp, brittle. Caleb nodded slowly. He stepped back, giving her space. "All right, you do it." He watched as she fumbled with the leather strap. Her fingers were shaking, but she pulled the knot tight with a fierce determination. She was terrified, he realized, but she was not broken. There was steel in her spine, buried under the fear. They mounted up and continued north. The sun climbed higher, turning the air shimmering and hot despite the bite of the wind. Around midday, the horizon began to darken. It wasn't rain clouds. It was a low, brown wall that seemed to grow out of the earth, swallowing the blue sky. "Dust!" Caleb shouted over the rising wind. He pulled his horse around, riding back to where Nell sat frozen, watching the approaching monster. "Cover your face!" he yelled. He pulled a bandana from his neck and tossed it to her. Nell caught it, her eyes wide. The wall of dust hit them a moment later, turning the world into a choking, blinding twilight. The wind roared, stinging their skin with millions of tiny particles of grit. "Stay close!" Caleb shouted. He guided his horse right up next to hers. Nell felt a surge of panic as his leg brushed against hers. But then the wind gusted so hard she felt her mare stumble. Caleb reached out, his hand gripping her mare's bridle, steadying the animal. He positioned his own horse broadside to the wind, creating a shelter for her. He hunched his shoulders, taking the brunt of the stinging sand. Nell tied the bandana over her nose and mouth, squinting through the haze. She saw him sitting there, head bowed against the gale, his body acting as a shield between her and the storm. For an hour. The wind howled. Nell huddled in the saddle, coughing into the cloth. Every time she looked up, he was there, solid, unmoving. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking into the storm. His eyes narrowed, his hand firm on her horse's reins. It was a strange, disorienting feeling. She was used to men taking things from her, space, dignity, safety. She was not used to a man offering his own body to keep the wind off her skin. When the wind finally died down, leaving a layer of fine brown dust over everything, Caleb straightened up. He shook the dust from his hat and looked at her. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes rimmed with red. "You all right?" he asked. Nell pulled the bandana down. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "Drink some water," he said, unhooking his canteen and handing it to her. She took it, careful not to touch his fingers. As she drank, the cool water soothing her grit-filled throat, she looked at him with a new, wary curiosity. They made camp that night in a hollow near a dry wash. There were no trees for shelter, just the endless canopy of stars that looked cold and indifferent. Caleb built a small fire from sagebrush and dried buffalo chips. It burned hot and fast, casting flickering shadows against the darkness. Nell sat on her bedroll, her knees pulled up to her chest. The darkness beyond the firelight felt heavy. Every rustle of the grass sounded like footsteps. Every cry of a coyote sounded like a man shouting. She lay down, wrapping herself in the thin blanket Caleb had provided. She closed her eyes, but sleep was a dangerous country. As soon as she drifted off, she was back in the saloon. She could smell the stale beer. She could feel the heat of the lamps. She heard the auctioneer's voice, booming like a judgment. "Sold, sold to the man in the back." She jerked awake with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sat up, disoriented, the cold air hitting her sweat-dampened skin. Caleb was lying a few yards away, on the other side of the dying fire. He was awake. He was propped up on one elbow, watching the perimeter of the camp. He looked at her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't tell her to be quiet. "Here," he said. He sat up and took off his heavy canvas coat. He tossed it across the fire. It landed near her feet. "It is cold tonight," he said simply. "That blanket is thin." Nell looked at the coat. It was large, heavy, and lined with sheepskin. "I am fine," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Take it." "Nell," he said. He lay back down, turning his back to her. "I am warm enough." She hesitated, then reached out and pulled the coat toward her. She draped it over her blanket. It was heavy, and it smelled of him. Tobacco, wood smoke, and horse. It was a masculine smell, one that should have frightened her. But as she huddled under the weight of it, the warmth seeped into her bones. It felt like a wall. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing across the fire. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't tried to comfort her with words or touch. He had just given her his warmth and turned away to give her privacy. The tears came then, hot and silent. She cried for the girl she had been 2 days ago. She cried for the shame of the auction block. She cried because, for the first time in years, she was warm, and she didn't know how to handle the kindness of a stranger who owned her debt but refused to own her. They arrived at the ranch the next afternoon. It wasn't a grand estate. It was a scar of human effort on the face of the wild. A small cabin built of rough-hewn logs and chinking mud sat in the shadow of a low ridge. There was a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a network of corrals made from split rails, and a windmill that turned lazily in the breeze, the metal vanes creaking with a rhythmic, mournful sound. It was lonely. There wasn't another building for miles in any direction. But as they rode into the yard, Nell noticed the details. The fences were mended, The yard was swept clean of debris. The tools leaning against the barn were oiled and organized. It was a place of hard, honest work. Caleb dismounted and walked over to help her, but she slid down before he could reach her. She stood in the dust, looking at the cabin. "This is it," Caleb said. "It is not a palace. It is standing." Nell said, "That is more than my father's house." Caleb led the horses into the corral and then walked to the cabin door. He pushed it open and gestured for her to enter. The inside was one large room with a stone hearth at one end, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. It was Spartan, masculine, and scrupulously clean. Caleb walked across the room to a second door in the back wall. This was for storage. "Mostly," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but I cleared it out before I left." He opened the door. It was a small room, barely big enough for a cot and a washstand. But there was a window with a shutter, and on the door there was a heavy iron latch. He pointed to the latch. "You see that?" Caleb said, catching her eye. "It is on the inside. You slide that bolt, and nobody comes in. Not me, not anyone." Nell looked at the bolt. She reached out and touched the cold iron. It was solid. "And the wage?" she asked, turning to face him. $2 a week, Caleb said, "and room and board. You cook, you keep the place clean, maybe help with the garden and the chickens. If you want to leave, I will pay you out to the day, and I will saddle a horse to take you to the stage line." Nell looked at him. She was looking for the trap. Men didn't give women rooms with locks. Men didn't pay wages to women they had bought for $1,000. "Why?" she asked. "Because I need the help," Caleb lied. "And because everyone deserves a door they can lock." Nell took a deep breath. She squared her shoulders. "I have rules," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were clenched in her skirts. "Name them," Caleb said. "I work. I earn my keep. But I am not a wife. I am not company. You stay on your side of the door. You do not touch me. And if I say I am leaving, you do not stop me." Caleb looked at her. His face was unreadable, but for a second, a shadow of hurt passed through his gray eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet sorrow that she felt the need to defend herself so fiercely against him. "Agreed," he said. The routine set in like the setting of mortar. For the first week, they moved around each other like ghosts. Nell rose before dawn, lighting the stove and putting coffee on to boil. She cooked biscuits and bacon, setting a plate for Caleb and one for herself at the opposite end of the small table. They ate in silence, the only sound the scraping of forks and the wind outside. The work was brutal. Nell had worked hard all her life, but the ranch was different. She hauled water from the well until her shoulders burned and her palms were blistered. She scrubbed the cabin floors on her hands and knees until the wood was pale and smooth. She beat the dust out of the rugs and mended the tears in Caleb's spare shirts. But the exhaustion was a mercy. It kept her mind from turning in circles. It kept the memories of the auction at bay. She began to watch Caleb. She watched him from the kitchen window as he worked in the corrals. He was a man of few words, but his hands spoke a language she hadn't seen before. She saw him with a colt that had been spooked by a rattlesnake. A normal cowboy would have roped the beast and broken it with force. Caleb spent 3 hours standing in the center of the corral, speaking in a low, rumbling drone. His hand extended, waiting for the horse to come to him. When the colt finally touched its nose to his palm, Caleb didn't grab it. He just stroked its neck, a touch so gentle it looked out of place on a man so hard. He treated the animals with a respect he didn't even show the townsfolk. He checked their hooves with care. He made sure they were fed before he ate his own dinner. One afternoon, he came in while she was kneading dough. He was carrying a long, heavy rifle, a Winchester repeater. Nell froze, her hands covered in flour. She stared at the gun. Caleb stopped. He saw the fear spike in her eyes. He slowly leaned the rifle against the wall near the door. "There are coyotes," he said, "and sometimes worse. If I am out on the range, you are here alone. I do not know how to use a gun," Nell said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I hate them, I know," Caleb said. "But out here, a tool is just a tool. It does not have malice unless the person holding it does." He picked up the rifle again, holding it open, showing her it was empty. "Come outside," he said. She followed him, reluctant, her stomach churning. He set a glass bottle on a fence post 50 yards away. He handed her the rifle. It was heavy, the wood warm from his hand. "Shoulder it tight," he instructed, standing a few feet away. "Do not lean back. Lean into it, like you are pushing against the wind." Nell lifted the rifle. Her arms shook. The metal sight danced around the bottle. "Breathe," Caleb said softly. His voice was right behind her ear, but he didn't touch her. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Just a breath and a squeeze." Nell closed one eye. She imagined the bottle was Rex Mallory's face. She imagined it was the fear that lived in her chest. She squeezed. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the sound cracking across the valley like a thunderclap. The bottle exploded in a shower of glittering glass. Nell lowered the rifle, her ears ringing. She looked at the shattered glass. A strange sensation washed over her. It wasn't pleasure. It was power. It was the realization that she could reach out and break something that threatened her. "Good shot," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was smiling, just a little, a small crinkle at the corner of his eyes. "Again," she said. The weather turned a week later. The high, clear skies vanished, replaced by a low ceiling of gray clouds that opened up and drenched the plains in a cold, relentless rain. The dry earth turned to gumbo mud. It clung to boots, skirts, and hooves, heavy and slick as grease. Nell was carrying a pail of slop to the pigs in the pen behind the barn. The rain was plastering her hair to her face, running down her neck. She was cold, tired, and her boots were caked with 5 pounds of mud each. As she stepped around a puddle, her foot slipped. She went down hard. The pail flew from her hand, splashing the foul-smelling slop all over the front of her dress and into the mud. She landed on her side, the breath knocked out of her. She lay there for a second, the rain beating down on her face, and then the dam broke. It wasn't just the fall. It was the auction. It was her father. It was the endless scrubbing, the fear, the isolation, the sheer weight of being 20 years old and feeling like her life was already over. She scrambled to her knees and screamed. It was a guttural, angry sound. She slammed her hands into the mud, sobbing, her shoulders heaving. Caleb came running from the barn. He had been mending a harness. He saw her on the ground, covered in mud and slop, weeping. "Nell!" He rushed over, reaching down to help her up. His hand grasped her upper arm to steady her. "Let me help you up." "No!" Nell shrieked. She jerked her arm away violently, scrambling backward in the mud like a crab. "Do not touch me! Do not put your hands on me!" She was hyperventilating, her eyes wild. In that moment, he wasn't Caleb. He was just a man with hands that could grab, could take, could sell. Caleb froze. He held his hands up, palms open, the rain dripping from his hat brim. He stepped back. Once, twice. "I am not touching you. Nell, I am right here. I am not moving." Nell wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth in the mud. The sobbing slowed to jagged, painful gasps. She looked at him, waiting for the anger, waiting for him to tell her she was hysterical, ungrateful. Caleb lowered his hands slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked old. He looked at her with a profound, aching sadness. "I know," he said quietly. His voice cut through the sound of the rain. I know what it feels like. To be in the dirt and have someone standing over you. Nell sniffed, wiping mud from her cheek. What do you know? You are a man. You walk where you please. Caleb looked out at the gray hills. My father had a ranch, he said, down in Texas. We worked it for 20 years. When the big cattle combine moved in, they wanted the water rights. My father said no. He looked back at Nell. They didn't buy him out. They burned him out. I was 16. I was in town when I saw the smoke. By the time I got back, the house was gone. My father was dead in the yard. And my sister, Sarah. His voice broke, just a fracture, but Nell heard it. She was inside, Caleb whispered. The roof had come down. I tried to move the beams. I tried until my hands burned, but I was not strong enough. I stood there and listened to the fire take her. And then the sheriff came, and he told me it was an accident. He told me to move on, because the man who ordered the fire owned the county. He looked at Nell, his eyes fierce and wet. I know what it is to be powerless. Nell, I know what it is to be small when the world is big and mean. I would rather cut off my own hand than make you feel that way again. Nell stared at him. The rain washed the mud from her face, revealing the shock. She saw the ghosts he carried. They were the same as hers. He wasn't a savior. He was a survivor. She slowly stood up. Her legs were shaking. She looked at her ruined dress, then at him. I ruined the slop, she said weakly. Caleb let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh. The pigs will eat the mud if it smells right, he said. Go inside. Get warm. I will finish up here. That night, the cabin was warm. The stove popped and hissed. Nell sat at the table, mending a tear in her skirt. Caleb was cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, fearful silence of the first week. It was softer. It was the silence of two people who shared a secret. Nell bit the thread and looked up. Why did you really do it? She asked. Caleb didn't look up from the rifle. He was polishing the stock with a rag. Do what? Spend the money. You said you wanted to expand the ranch. You said you needed fences. You threw it all away on a stranger. Caleb stopped polishing. He set the rifle down on the table. I have enough ghosts. Nell? He said, I wake up every night thinking about the ones I could not save. When I saw you in that chair, looking like you were already dead. He looked at her across the lamplight. I thought, if I can stop this one thing from happening, maybe the other ghosts will let me sleep. Maybe I can look in a mirror and not see a coward. Nell felt a tightness in her throat. It was a dangerous feeling. It was a warmth that started in her chest and spread outward. She had spent her life building walls to keep people out, but Caleb wasn't trying to break down her walls. He was just sitting outside them, keeping the fire lit so she wouldn't be cold. You are not a coward? Caleb, she said softly. Caleb looked at her, his eyes intense. For a moment, the air between them crackled. It was a pull, magnetic and terrifying. He stood up abruptly, grabbing the rifle. I need to check the horses, he said. He went out into the rain, leaving her alone with the lamp and the sudden, aching realization that she didn't want him to go. 2 days later, the sky cleared. The sun came out, drying the mud to a hard crust. Caleb saddled his horse early. He packed his saddlebags with jerky and a canteen. I have to go into town, he told Nell as she stood on the porch. We are out of flour, and I need to buy more rounds for the rifle. Nell felt a spike of fear. Town meant Dry Creek. Town meant Mallory. Will you be long? She asked. 2 days, maybe 3, Caleb said. He adjusted his hat. You have the rifle. You know how to use it. Lock the door at night. If anyone comes, you fire a warning shot. If they keep coming, you shoot for the center. I know, Nell said. She wrapped her arms around herself. The ranch felt suddenly enormous. The silence of the plains, which she had started to get used to, now felt oppressive. Caleb swung up into the saddle. He looked down at her. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more. "Be safe, Nell," was all he said. He turned the horse and rode toward the ridge. Nell watched him go. She watched until he was just a speck against the brown earth, and then until he was gone entirely. She turned back to the empty cabin. She looked at the lock on her door. She looked at the rifle leaning in the corner. She was safe here. She was free. She was the mistress of her own time for the next 3 days. But as the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of the lonely cabin, Nell realized with a jolt that stopped her breath that she wasn't afraid of him coming back. She was terrified that he wouldn't. She sat on the porch step, watching the horizon, and waited. Dry Creek was not a town that forgave easily, and it certainly never forgot. When Caleb Rourke rode back into the main street, the air felt different. It was no longer just the dusty indifference of a frontier outpost. It was sharp, charged with a static electricity that prickled at the back of his neck. He tied his horse at the hitching rail outside the general store. The street was busy with midday traffic, wagons hauling timber, miners coming down from the hills for supplies, and the usual drift of cowhands looking for work or trouble. As Caleb adjusted his hat and stepped onto the boardwalk, the conversation nearby died. 2 men leaning against a support post stopped talking mid-sentence. They looked Caleb up and down, their eyes sliding away when he met their gaze, but the smirks remained fixed on their faces. "I heard she was worth every penny," one of them muttered, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to claim innocence. "Keep the change," the other snickered. Caleb kept walking. His boots struck the wood with a heavy, rhythmic thud. He had expected this. He had known that buying a woman, even to free her, would paint a target on his back. To these men, he was not a savior. He was just a man who had hoarded a fortune and spent it on a luxury they could only leer at. The judgment burned, not because he cared for their opinion, but because he knew that every dirty joke they told stripped another layer of dignity away from Nell. He pushed open the door of the general store. The bell above the frame jingled, a cheerful sound that clashed with the tension in his gut. The store was cool and smelled of pickle brine and coffee beans. Caleb moved to the counter, pulling a list from his pocket. He needed flour, coffee, beans, and a box of .44 caliber cartridges. The storekeeper, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, who usually had a friendly word for everyone, looked nervous. He kept glancing toward the back of the store where the shadows were deep between the stacks of dry goods. "Just the basics today." "Caleb?" Henderson asked, his voice pitching high. "Just the basics," Caleb replied, "and a sack of grain for the horses." As Henderson began to weigh out the flour, a voice drifted from the back of the store. It was a rich, smooth baritone, the kind of voice that sounded like expensive whiskey pouring over ice. "It is a terrible thing," the voice said, "when a man forgets the laws of property." Caleb stiffened. He did not turn around. He knew that voice. It belonged to Rex Mallory. Mallory stepped out from the aisle, tapping his silver-tipped cane against a barrel of nails. He was dressed immaculately in a black frock coat, looking entirely out of place among the dusty sacks of feed. "I had a distinct agreement," Mallory said, addressing the empty air as if Caleb were not standing 5 feet away. "A verbal contract is binding in this territory. When a man interferes with commerce, he is nothing more than a thief." Caleb placed his hands on the counter. He kept them flat, away from the revolver on his hip. "I broke no law." "Mallory," Caleb said, his voice low and grinding like millstones. "I paid the price asked. I signed the paper." Mallory turned then, his eyes cold and dead, like a lizard sunning itself on a rock. "You stole my property, Rourke. You humiliated me. And you walked away with something that does not belong to you. She is not a thing." Caleb said, "She is a person, and she is free." Mallory laughed. It was a dry, rustling sound. Free? No woman is free out here. She belongs to someone. If not her father, then you. And if not you. Well, the wheel turns. Mallory stepped closer, invading Caleb's personal space. He smelled of bay rum and stale cigar smoke. "Enjoy your purchase, cowboy," Mallory whispered. "While you can. A man who steals a prize best be ready to defend it." Mallory tipped his hat to the terrified storekeeper and walked out. The bell jingled merrily as the door closed behind him. Caleb stood frozen, his knuckles white against the wood of the counter. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Henderson cleared his throat nervously. He pushed the sack of flour across the counter. "Mr. Rourke," he said quietly, leaning in. "You need to watch your back. Mallory has been talking. And there are men in this town, men who owe him money, men who just like to see blood, who are listening. They do not intend to let this go." Caleb looked at the shopkeeper. He saw the fear there, but also a flicker of pity. "Thank you, Henderson," Caleb said. He paid for his goods, the coins clinking loudly in the silence. He walked out into the bright, harsh sunlight. The weight of the supplies nothing compared to the weight settling in his chest. Back at the ranch, the silence was absolute. Nell had been alone for 2 days. At first, the solitude had been terrifying. Every creak of the windmill, every shift of the wind in the eaves had sent her reaching for the rifle Caleb had left her. But as the hours stretched into days, the fear began to recede, replaced by a strange, hollow kind of peace. For the first time in her 20 years of life, there was no one to tell her what to do. There was no father shouting for his supper. There were no creditors banging on the door. There was just the wind, the sun, and the work. She tried to keep busy. Idleness was dangerous. It gave her mind time to travel back to the auction block. She washed her few clothes and Caleb's spare shirts, boiling the water in a heavy iron kettle over a fire in the yard. She strung a line between the corner of the cabin and the barn, hanging the wet fabric up to dry. The sheets snapped and danced in the relentless wind, sounding like sails on a ship. Nell stood there, her hands red and wet, watching the white cloth billow against the vast blue sky. She felt small. The land was so big, stretching out in every direction until it blurred into the horizon. It made her feel insignificant, a speck of dust on a table. But it also felt like a question. Who was she, if she wasn't Silas Hart's daughter? Who was she, if she wasn't the girl sold for $1,000? She didn't know the answer. She walked the fence line, checking the wire as Caleb had taught her. She practiced lifting the rifle, her arms growing stronger, the weight of the wood and steel becoming familiar. She was building a shell. She realized, a hard outer layer to protect the soft, bruised thing inside. She was near the creek bed when she smelled it. It was a faint, acrid scent, sharper than dust. She stopped, lifting her head like a deer scenting a predator. She looked to the west. A gray smudge stained the horizon. It wasn't a cloud. It was darker, dirtier, and it was growing. Fire. The word hit her with the force of a physical blow. Fire on the prairie was death. It moved faster than a horse, ate everything in its path, and left nothing but black ash. She turned and ran back toward the cabin. Panic clawed at her throat. What was she supposed to do? Run? Stay? Then she saw a rider cresting the ridge to the south. He was riding hard. His horse stretched out in a full gallop, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. Caleb. He thundered into the yard, pulling the horse up so sharply it reared back on its haunches. He didn't wait for the animal to settle before he vaulted from the saddle. "Get the sacks!" he shouted. His voice was raw, stripped of all calm. "Get the burlap sacks and soak them in the trough, now!" Nell didn't ask questions. The terror in his voice galvanized her. She ran to the barn, grabbing a stack of rough burlap feed sacks. She dragged them to the water trough and plunged them in, the cold water soaking her sleeves. Caleb was already there, stripping the saddle off his blown horse and turning it loose into the corral. He grabbed a shovel and 2 of the wet sacks. "It is small, but the wind is driving it this way," he yelled over the rising roar of the wind. "We have to beat it back at the fire break." They ran toward the west pasture. The smoke was thicker now, stinging her eyes, turning the afternoon sun into a bloody red disk. She could see the flames, a jagged line of orange licking at the dry grass, moving with terrifying speed. For the next hour, there was no thought, only action. They stood at the edge of the plowed strip of earth Caleb had cut weeks ago as a fire break. But the wind was carrying sparks across the gap, igniting the grass on their side. Nell swung the heavy, wet sack, slamming it down on the creeping flames. The heat was intense, searing the hair on her arms, drying the sweat on her face instantly. "Here!" Caleb shouted, pointing to a flare-up near a fence post. She rushed over, beating at the fire. The smoke filled her lungs, making her cough until she gagged. Her eyes streamed with tears. She lost track of where she was. She was just a machine of survival, swinging the sack, stomping on embers, fighting a living, hungry beast. Caleb was beside her, a blur of motion. He shoveled dirt onto the larger flames, his shirt soaked with sweat and soot. At one point, the wind shifted, sending a wall of heat and smoke engulfing them. Nell stumbled back, blinded. She felt a hard body slam into hers. Caleb grabbed her, spinning her away from a patch of burning sagebrush. "Move back!" he roared, his chest heaving against her back. They were pressed together, hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder. In the chaos, the contact wasn't gentle. It was rough, desperate. She could feel the heat of his body through his clothes, the hammering of his heart. For a second, amidst the smoke and the fear, a jolt of awareness shot through her, electric and confusing. He was solid. He was real. He was the only thing standing between her and the fire. Then he pushed her toward the green grass. "Go to the creek. Get more water." They fought until their arms felt like lead. Slowly, miraculously. The wind died down. The fire, deprived of its fuel and checked by the break, began to sputter out, leaving a blackened, smoking scar across the earth. Twilight settled over the ranch, blue and hazy with lingering smoke. The air smelled of char and exhausted triumph. Nell stood by the water trough. She leaned against the wooden side, her legs trembling so hard she thought she might fall. She was covered in soot. Her dress was singed at the hem. Her hands were blistered. Caleb stood a few feet away. He had taken off his hat and was wiping his forehead with his sleeve. He looked like a demon from the pit, his face black with ash, his eyes stark white in contrast. He looked at her. He dropped his gaze to her hands, then to her face. "You did good, Nell," he rasped. His voice was wrecked by the smoke. Nell nodded. She couldn't speak. She just breathed, greedily pulling the cool air into her lungs. Caleb stepped closer. He reached out a hand, then hesitated. His hand hovered in the air between them, dark and scarred. "You have—" He started, gesturing vaguely to her face. Nell didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She looked at his hand, then at his eyes. She was too tired to be afraid. And after the fire, after feeling his body shield her from the heat, the fear seemed to have burned away, leaving something raw in its place. She took a half-step forward, closing the distance. Caleb let out a slow breath. He reached out and gently, with a reverence that made her heart stutter, wiped a streak of soot from her cheekbone with his thumb. His skin was rough, calloused like old leather, but his touch was impossibly light. He lingered for a second, his fingers grazing her jawline. Nell's breath hitched. The sound was loud in the quiet yard. She felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a terrifying intimacy, far more dangerous than the fire. Caleb pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He stepped back, clearing his throat, putting safe distance between them again. "Go wash up," he said, turning away. "I will check the horses." Later, after they had scrubbed the worst of the soot from their skin and eaten a silent meal of beans and stale biscuits, they sat on the porch. The night was dark, the stars hidden by the lingering haze. Nell sat on the steps, hugging her knees. Caleb sat in the rocking chair, the wood groaning softly as he moved. "My mother died of a fever," Nell said suddenly. She didn't know why she was saying it. Maybe the brush with death made the past feel closer. Caleb stopped rocking. "I was 6, Nell continued, staring into the dark. "She used to tell me stories, fairy tales, mostly, but the ending was always the same. The princess runs away." She paused. "She tried to leave him. My father. She packed a bag one night. She told me we were going on an adventure, but he caught us at the door." She wrapped her arms tighter around her legs. "He didn't hit her. He just laughed. He took the bag and dumped it on the floor. He told her she wouldn't last a day out there. He told her the world was full of men like him, and at least she knew the devil she had." Nell looked up at Caleb. Her eyes were dry, but her voice trembled. "She told me later," she said. "Nell, remember this. Men always take. It is what they are for. They take your work, they take your body, they take your hope. And if you let them, they take your soul." She went silent. The words hung in the air, bitter and old. Caleb sat still. He looked at the silhouette of the woman on the steps, a woman who had been sold, who had every reason to believe that hateful philosophy. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your mother was a strong woman to try," Caleb said softly, "but she was wrong about one thing." Nell looked at him. "Not all men want to take, Nell. Some of us are just trying to give back what was stolen from us." The earnest pain in his voice shook her. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't a boast. It was a confession. Nell looked away, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. The piece of the ranch was a fragile bubble, and the world outside was determined to pop it. Over the next week, the atmosphere shifted. When Caleb rode to the edge of his property to check the herd, he saw riders on the distant ridges. They didn't approach. They just watched, dark silhouettes against the sky, like vultures waiting for something to die. In town, though neither of them visited, the rumors were breeding like flies. The churchwomen, clutching their Bibles and their self-righteousness, whispered that the Hart girl was living in sin with that cowboy. They said she had seduced him, or that he was keeping her as a concubine. The truth, that they slept on opposite sides of a locked door, was too boring for their tongues. Fathers warned their sons to stay away from the Rourke place. A few men, those who knew the hardness of life, quietly admired what Caleb had done. They tipped their hats to him in their minds, but they kept their mouths shut. Rex Mallory's shadow was long, and his memory for grudges was longer. The escalation began on a Tuesday. Nell was walking the north fence line, checking for breaks where the calves might slip through. She reached a wooden post near the canyon trail and stopped. A scream rose in her throat, but she choked it down, turning it into a gasp of horror. Tied to the fence post with a piece of rough twine was a jackrabbit. It had been dead for a day. Its throat was cut, and its body hung limp and twisted. It wasn't just a dead animal. It was a message. This is what happens to things that are caught. She backed away, her stomach turning. She turned and ran back to the cabin, stumbling over the uneven ground. Caleb met her in the yard. He saw her pale face and grabbed her shoulders. "What is it? What happened?" Nell pointed to the north, breathless. "On the fence. They left. They left something." Caleb rode out. He came back 20 minutes later, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't carry the rabbit. He had cut it down and buried it. He went into the cabin and came out with the rifle. "Come here," he said. He took her to the edge of the yard. He pointed at the ground. "Look at the dirt. Nell, tell me what you see." Nell looked. "I see dirt." "Grass. Look closer. See that depression? The edge is sharp. That is a fresh track, a shod horse. The shoe has a notch in the left heel." He knelt down, tracing the shape with his finger. "Mallory's men," he said, "they want you to be afraid. They want you to run." He stood up and looked at her. "You are not alone anymore. Nell, I see the tracks too. I know they are there. We watch, we wait, and if they cross the line, we defend this place." His voice was steel. He wasn't telling her to hide. He was inviting her to fight beside him. The protective instinct radiating off him made her feel safer than any locked door ever could. The storm hit 3 nights later. It had been building all afternoon, a towering cathedral of black clouds that piled up against the mountains. The air turned heavy and green, pressing down on the earth. When it broke, it was with a violence that shook the cabin to its foundations. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound like the sky tearing apart. Lightning flashed in rapid strobe light bursts, illuminating the room in harsh, white glares. The wind howled at the shutters, rattling the latch, sounding like 100 men trying to break in. Nell was sitting on her bed in the small room, with every crack of thunder. She flinched. The noise. It was too loud. Suddenly, she wasn't in the cabin. She was back in the saloon. The thunder became the banging of the auctioneer's gavel. The wind was the roar of the drunken crowd. The lightning was the flash of greed in her father's eyes. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was being crushed by a giant hand. She scrambled off the bed, backing into the corner, sliding down the wall. She clamped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The door to her room opened. Caleb stood there, silhouetted by the lantern light from the main room. He saw her in the corner, eyes wide and unseeing, hyperventilating. "Nell?" She didn't answer. She just stared at him, terror etched into every line of her face. Caleb didn't rush to her. He didn't try to grab her. He knew the look of a panicked animal. To crowd her now would be to break her. He walked to the far side of the small room and sat on the floor, his back against the wall, stretching his legs out. He placed the lantern on the floor between them. "Nell." "Look at me," he said. His voice was low, deep, and impossibly steady. It was an anchor in the storm. Nell shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They are here," she whispered. "They are shouting." "No," Caleb said firmly. "That is the thunder. Listen to it. It is just the sky clearing its throat." He kept his eyes locked on hers. "Feel the floor. Nell, it is wood, pitch pine. I laid these boards myself. They are solid. They are not going anywhere." Nell pressed her hands against the planks. "Rough, solid. Look at the walls," Caleb continued, his voice a rhythmic chant. "Logs, mud, strong enough to hold back the wind. You are inside. You are safe." He described the sound of the rain on the roof, like galloping horses. He described the smell of the ozone. He pulled her, inch by inch, out of the memory and back into the present. Nell's breathing began to slow. The constriction in her chest loosened. She focused on his voice. It was deep and rumbling, a sound that vibrated in her bones. She looked at him. He was sitting there, relaxed, hands resting loosely on his knees. He wasn't afraid. And because he wasn't afraid, she realized she didn't have to be either. The emotional intimacy of the moment hit her harder than the storm. He had walked into her darkness and sat down with her until the light came back. It felt more intimate than if he had held her in his arms. An hour later, the storm had passed, leaving only a steady, rhythmic rain. Caleb had returned to the main room. He was standing by the window, looking out into the wet night. Nell opened her door. She walked quietly across the floorboards. Caleb turned. "You all right?" he asked. Nell nodded. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I wanted to say thank you," she whispered. For staying." Caleb looked at her. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the softness of his mouth. "You do not have to thank me," he said. "Storms are hard." Nell took a step closer. They were standing in the doorway of the main room now. "You could have left me in there," she said. "You could have told me to be quiet. That is what my father would have done." "I am not your father," Caleb said. The words were fierce, almost angry. Nell looked at his hands, resting on the door frame. They were strong hands, capable of violence, but she had seen them be gentle. She remembered his thumb on her cheek, wiping away the soot. Without thinking, she reached out. She placed her hand over his on the wood. His skin was warm. A jolt went through her, sharp and sudden. Caleb froze. He looked down at their hands, her pale, small fingers resting on his scarred knuckles. He looked up at her face. Her eyes were wide, dark, and searching. In them, he saw a question. He saw a need that mirrored his own, a hunger to be held, to be known, to be comforted. The air in the room grew thin. The pull between them was undeniable now. It was a physical force, dragging them toward each other. Caleb felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to turn his hand over. He wanted to lace his fingers with hers. He wanted to pull her against him and bury his face in her hair. But the fear stopped him. The fear that he was just another man taking advantage of a woman who had no other choice. He pulled his hand away. Nell flinched, pulling her hand back to her chest. "Caleb," she breathed. "I can't," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Why?" Nell asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Because I want to," Caleb confessed. The words were torn out of him. "I want to, too much. And if I start, I am afraid I will not be able to stop. And I will not become a man who takes—" He stepped back into the shadows of the room. "Go to sleep. Nell, lock your door." Nell stood there for a moment, her heart pounding with a mixture of rejection and a thrilling, terrifying understanding. He wasn't rejecting her. He was protecting her. From himself. She turned and went to her room. She slid the bolt home. She lay in the dark, listening to the rain. She could feel him on the other side of the thin wall. She imagined him lying there, awake, staring at the ceiling. The wall separated them, but it also connected them. They were two wounded animals in the same den, circling each other, afraid to bite, but starving for warmth. Outside, the clouds finally broke. The rain stopped. The cold stars came out, glittering over the vast, wet prairie. The land was still huge, still dangerous, still wild. But as Nell closed her eyes, she realized that for the first time, the vastness didn't feel quite so empty. Caleb Rourke rode south toward Dry Creek with the sun beating against his back. His saddlebags lighter than usual, but his mind heavy with a burden he could not set down. He was driving 6 steers to market, a pitifully small lot, but enough to raise the cash he needed. His plan was simple, though it sat sour in his gut. He intended to find the men holding Silas Hart's remaining markers, the gambling debts that hung over the old man like a shroud, and pay them off. He would not do it for Silas. He would do it to sever the last rotting tether that bound Nell to her father. As long as Silas owed money, he would look at his daughter and see currency. Caleb wanted to burn that currency to ash. As his horse picked its way through a dry wash, Caleb's thoughts turned to the question that had been gnawing at him for 3 nights. Marriage. It was the practical solution. In the eyes of the law and the church, a wife was protected. If Nell were his wife, Mallory could not touch her without answering to a husband's rights. The town's gossip would lose its venomous sting, turning from accusations of sin to mere chatter about a hasty courtship. But every time the word formed in his mind, he saw the auction block. He saw Nell sitting in that chair, paralyzed by the transaction of her own life. If he asked her to marry him now, would it not feel like another sale? Would she say yes because she wanted him, or because she felt she owed him? The thought made him sick. He shifted in the saddle, looking out at the endless, undulating brown grass. He wanted her. God, he wanted her with a fierceness that frightened him. He wanted her laugh, which he had only heard once. He wanted the quiet strength he saw when she held the rifle, but he would not trade her freedom for his peace of mind. He would not put a ring on her finger that felt like a shackle. He spurred the horse forward, the steers lowing in protest, pushing toward the town that lay like a festering wound on the horizon. At the ranch, the wind had died down to a whisper, leaving the silence thick and unnerving. Nell was in the yard, scattering feed for the few chickens Caleb kept. She liked this chore. It was simple. The birds were foolish and harmless, pecking at the dirt with a singular focus that she envied. She heard the horses before she saw them. The rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed earth made her freeze. She looked toward the ridge, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sun. 3 riders were coming down the slope. They were not moving with the urgency of a raid, but with a slow, arrogant casualness that made the hair on Nell's arms stand up. She dropped the feed bucket. The corn scattered in the dust. She recognized the lead rider by the slump of his shoulders. It was her father. Silas Hart rode a borrowed nag that looked as tired as he did. Flanking him were 2 men Nell had seen leaning against the wall at the saloon. Mallory's hired hands. One was a thick-necked man named Brody, who wore a grease-stained duster. The other was a wire-thin man with a lazy eye, known around town only as Pike. Nell's stomach dropped. She took a step back toward the cabin, her hand going to her throat. Caleb was gone. The rifle was inside, leaning against the table. The riders stopped at the gate. Silas looked down at her. He had shaved, and he was wearing a clean shirt, but his eyes were the same, wet, shifting, full of a terrified bravado. "Hello, Eleanor?" Silas called out. His voice was slurred, the edges of the words rounded by midday whiskey. Nell did not answer. She stood her ground, though her knees were trembling. "Are you not going to invite your father in?" Silas asked, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief. "I have come to visit, to see how you are settling in." "I am fine," Nell said. Her voice sounded thin in the open air. "Caleb is not here." "We know," Pike said. The thin man smiled, revealing yellow teeth. "We watched him ride out this morning. 6 steers. Not much of a herd." Silas chuckled nervously. Now, we are just here for a family reunion. I want to make peace. Nell, I have been thinking. It is not right. Us being estranged. A father should be with his girl." "Go away," Nell said. She took another step backward. Brody, the big man, nudged his horse forward, pushing the gate open with the animal's chest. The wood groaned and splintered. "That is no way to speak to your kin," Brody rumbled. They rode into the yard. The horses seemed enormous, towering over her. Nell felt the old panic rising, the suffocating feeling of being small and helpless. "Get your things, Nell," Silas said, his voice hardening. "You are coming back with me. I am not going anywhere with you," Nell said. "I live here. You live where I say you live," Silas snapped, his facade of kindness cracking. "Do you think Rourke can keep you? He is just a cowboy. He owes Mr. Mallory money now. A lot of money. He does not owe anyone," Nell shouted. "He paid you. He paid for a contract," Silas yelled back. "But contracts can be broken. Mr. Mallory says the sale was invalid. He says you belong to the town until the debts are fully settled. And I say you belong to me." He swung down from his horse, stumbling slightly as his boots hit the ground. "Come on, girl, do not make a scene. We are going to fetch your bag, and we are going to ride back to town. Mr. Mallory is willing to forgive my markers if I bring you back. He wants to discuss terms with you personally." Nell saw the trap closing. It wasn't about her father. It was about Mallory. He couldn't stand that he had lost, so he was using the one thing he could control, her father's weakness, to drag her back. "No," Nell said. She turned and ran for the cabin door. "Get her!" Brody shouted. Nell scrambled up the porch steps. She grabbed the latch, throwing the door open. She made it 2 steps inside, her eyes locking on the rifle leaning against the table, before a heavy hand clamped onto her arm. Brody jerked her back. She flew off her feet, slamming into the door frame. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she didn't stop fighting. She clawed at his hand, digging her nails into his wrist. "Let me go," she screamed. Brody laughed. He dragged her out onto the porch like a sack of grain. "You have got some fight in you, little filly. Mallory likes them feisty." Nell kicked him in the shin. He grunted but didn't let go. He spun her around, pinning her against the rough log wall of the cabin. His other hand came up to grab her jaw, squeezing until her teeth ground together. Silas stood in the yard, watching. He looked pale. "Don't hurt her, Brody. Just get her on the horse." "Shut up, old man," Pike said from the yard. He had dismounted and was leaning against his horse, rolling a cigarette. Let him teach her some manners first. Nell looked at her father. He looked away. A cold, white-hot rage exploded in her chest. It was different from the fear. It was cleaner. It was the absolute, final refusal to be this man's property. She stomped her heel down on Brody's instep with everything she had. Brody roared in pain and loosened his grip just enough. Nell twisted away. She didn't run for the yard. She dove back into the cabin. She hit the floor, scrambling on her hands and knees toward the table. Brody was right behind her. "You little bitch!" Nell grabbed the barrel of the Winchester. She rolled onto her back, bringing the stock to her shoulder just as Caleb had taught her. Lean into it, like pushing against the wind. Brody filled the doorway, a dark silhouette against the bright afternoon. He was reaching for his pistol. Nell didn't think. She didn't breathe. She just squeezed. The rifle roared. The sound was deafening in the small space. Brody was thrown backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. He hit the porch railing and flipped over it, landing in the dirt with a wet thud. Silence crashed back into the yard, ringing in Nell's ears. She lay on the floor, the rifle smoking in her hands. She stared at the empty doorway. From the yard, Pike shouted something unintelligible. Then came the sound of scrambling boots and panicked horses. "She killed him." Silas was screaming. "Oh God, she killed him! Let us go!" Pike yelled. "Leave him! We have to go!" Nell crawled to the door. She pulled herself up, using the frame for support. She saw Pike and her father whipping their horses, galloping out of the gate and toward the ridge as if the devil himself were snapping at their heels. Brody lay in the dirt near the steps. He was groaning, clutching his shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, dark and glossy. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't getting up. Nell lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking so hard the metal rattled. She looked at the blood. She looked at the man writhing in the dust. She had done it. She had shot a man. The horror of it washed over her, cold and dizzying. But beneath the horror, beneath the nausea that roiled in her stomach, there was something else, a fierce, vibrating relief. She sat down on the threshold, the rifle across her lap, and watched the horizon, waiting for the judgment to come. It was an hour later when Caleb returned. He saw the broken gate first, then he saw the neighbor, a man named Mr. Gable from 3 miles east, standing in the yard holding the reins of his horse and looking terrified. Caleb spurred his horse into a run. He hit the ground before the animal stopped, his revolver already in his hand. Gable threw his hands up. "Do not shoot! Rourke, I just found him like this." Caleb looked at the ground. Brody was unconscious, his breathing shallow. His shoulder was a mess of torn fabric and blood, bound clumsily with a bandana. "Where is she?" Caleb demanded. His voice was a growl. Gable pointed to the porch. Nell was sitting exactly where she had fallen. She was staring at nothing. The rifle lay at her feet. Caleb holstered his gun and ran to her. He fell to his knees beside her, grabbing her hands. They were ice cold. "Nell? Nell, look at me. Are you hurt?" Nell turned her head slowly. Her eyes focused on him, wide and dark. "I shot him," she whispered. Caleb looked at Brody, then back at her. He saw the bruise forming on her jaw where Brody had grabbed her. He saw the torn sleeve of her dress. "Did he touch you?" Caleb asked. The violence in his voice was terrifying. "He tried to take me," Nell said. "My father. He brought them. They were going to take me back to Mallory." Caleb closed his eyes for a second. A murderous rage surged through him, so powerful his vision blurred. He wanted to ride to town. He wanted to find Silas Hart and Rex Mallory and tear them apart with his bare hands. But he felt Nell's hands trembling in his. He opened his eyes. He couldn't be that man. She needed him here. "Mr. Gable cleared his throat from the yard. I bandaged him up, Rourke, but I cannot stay. If Mallory finds out I helped." "Go," Caleb said without looking back. "Thank you, Gable, but go." Gable mounted his horse and rode off, eager to be away from the smell of blood and trouble. Caleb helped Nell stand. He guided her inside the cabin, away from the sight of the wounded man. He sat her down at the table and poured her a cup of water from the bucket. "Drink," he said, gentle. Nell took the cup. Her teeth chattered against the tin rim. "Is he dead?" she asked. "No," Caleb said. "He is alive. You hit him in the shoulder. It was a good shot. Nell, you stopped him. They will come for me," she said. Her voice broke. "They said I would hang." Caleb pulled a chair out and sat opposite her. He leaned forward, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. Nobody is going to hang you. You defended your home. You defended yourself. Mallory owns the sheriff," Nell whispered. "He will say it was murder. He will say I lured him here. My father will lie for him." Caleb knew she was right. If they waited here, the sheriff would come with a posse. They would claim Brody was just collecting a debt, or that Nell had gone mad. In a town like Dry Creek, the truth was whatever the richest man paid for it to be. "We are not staying here," Caleb said. Nell looked at him, panic flaring. "We have to run?" "No," Caleb said firmly. "If we run, we look guilty. If we run, they hunt us down like animals, and they shoot us in a canyon somewhere." He took a deep breath. "We are going to town. We are going to ride straight to the sheriff's office. We are going to drop Brody on the doctor's doorstep, and we are going to tell the judge exactly what happened before Mallory has a chance to spin his story." Nell shook her head violently. "No, I can't go back there. I can't stand in front of them." "We have to," Caleb said. "It is the only way to end this. We face them. I will be right beside you. I will not let them touch you. I swear it." Nell looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes. He was afraid too, but she also saw the resolve. He was betting their lives on the truth. They waited until nightfall to move Brody. Caleb loaded the unconscious man into the back of the wagon. He hitched the team, his movements efficient and grim. He came back into the cabin. Nell was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "We leave at first light," Caleb said. "The trail is too rough for the wagon in the dark. We will take shifts watching." Nell didn't turn around. "I don't want to die. Caleb, you are not going to die," he said. "I might," she said. She turned to face him. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the room. "We both might. If we go into that town, we might never come out." Caleb crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her. "I will get you out," he said, "even if I have to burn the whole town down to do it." Nell looked at him. She looked at the scar on his cheek, the way his hands hung at his sides, ready to fight the world for her. And in that moment, the dam broke. The fear, the adrenaline, the weeks of repressed longing, the terror of tomorrow. It all collapsed into a singular, overwhelming need. "I don't want to be a ghost," Nell said, her voice shaking. "I don't want to die without knowing." "Knowing what?" Caleb asked softly. Nell stepped closer. She reached out and took his hand. She pressed it against her chest, right over her heart. He could feel it hammering like a trapped bird. "I don't want to die without knowing what it is like to be wanted," she whispered. "Not as a thing to be bought, not as a debt to be paid, but as me." Caleb stopped breathing. He looked at her face, illuminated by the fire. She wasn't a victim in that moment. She was a woman making a choice. "Nell," he rasped. His voice was rough with desire and fear. "Do not ask this of me unless you are sure." "I am sure," she said. Caleb stepped back, pulling his hand away gently. "You are scared. Nell, you are full of adrenaline. Tomorrow you might hate me for this." "I could never hate you," she said. She followed him. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Please, Caleb, I need to know that I am yours. Not because you paid for me, but because I chose you." Caleb looked into her eyes. He searched for any sign of hesitation, any sign that she was doing this out of gratitude or obligation. He saw only a fierce, naked hunger that matched his own. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice breaking. "Yes," Nell whispered. "Right now? With me?" "Yes." Caleb let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He reached out and wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her as if she were made of glass, terrified that his own strength would shatter her. But Nell didn't shatter. She melted into him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, pressing her body against the hard wall of his chest. "Caleb," she breathed against his skin. He lifted his head and kissed her. It was a hesitant kiss at first, a question asked in the silence, but when she opened her mouth to him, when she sighed into the kiss, the hesitation vanished. He swept her up into his arms. He carried her not to her small room with the lock, but to his bed near the hearth. He laid her down on the quilt. He undressed her with trembling hands. Every movement was a question. "Is this okay? Can I do this?" "And every time," she answered with a touch, a nod, a lift of her hips. When he finally lay over her, skin to skin, the scars on his chest rough against her softness, Nell felt the tears come again, but they weren't tears of shame. She ran her hands over his back, feeling the muscles bunch and shift. She felt the heavy, driving rhythm of his heart against hers. Caleb looked down at her. His eyes were dark, dilated, full of a worshipful awe. "Nell," he whispered, "you are so beautiful." He moved with her, not taking, but giving. He watched her face, attuned to every breath she took. When she gasped, he stopped. When she arched into him, he followed. For the first time in her life, Nell felt powerful. She wasn't being used. She was being answered. She was the fire, and he was the wood, and they were burning together in the center of the vast, cold world. She cried out his name, clutching his shoulders, anchoring herself to him as the wave crashed over them both. Afterward, the silence in the cabin was heavy and sweet. They lay tangled together under the thick wool blanket. The fire had burned down to embers. casting a dull red glow over the room. Nell rested her head on Caleb's chest. She listened to his heartbeat slowing down. She felt his arm draped over her, heavy and protective. She felt sore, tired, and terrified of what the morning would bring. But she also felt whole. The hollow place inside her where the shame had lived was filled. Caleb shifted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I do not regret it," he murmured into her hair. "No matter what happens in town tomorrow, no matter what they say, I do not regret a single moment of this." Nell tightened her arm across his waist. "Neither do I," she said. She lifted her head to look at him. "I always thought." She hesitated. "I always thought that if a man touched me, I would disappear, that I would just become a thing again." Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were gentle. "You are not a thing, Nell. You are the only real thing I have ever known." Nell smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it reached her eyes. "This is the first time," she said softly. "The first time I do not feel like property." Caleb pulled her closer, wrapping the blanket tighter around them. "Sleep," he said. "We need the strength." Nell closed her eyes. She slept without dreaming, anchored by the weight of his arm and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Dawn came too soon. It arrived with a gray, unforgiving light that crept through the window and stole the magic of the night away. The wind was already howling outside, whistling through the chinking in the logs. Caleb was up first. Nell watched from the bed as he dressed. He put on his shirt, his vest, his coat. He strapped his gun belt around his waist, checking the action of the revolver. He looked different to her now. He wasn't just the cowboy who had bought her. He was the man who had trembled in her arms. He was the man who had asked for permission before he kissed her. Nell sat up, pulling the blanket around her. She felt the ache in her muscles, a physical reminder of the night. She got up and dressed quickly. She put on her sturdy boots and the heavy coat. She braided her hair back tight, pulling the severity of her face into focus. Caleb was waiting for her by the door. He had the rifle in his hand. "Are you ready?" he asked. Nell looked around the cabin. It was small. It was rough, but it had been a home. She walked over to him. She reached out and took his hand. "I am ready," she said. They walked out into the cold morning air. The wind hit them instantly, biting and sharp. The wagon was waiting, the horses stamping their feet, their breath pluming in the air. In the back, under a tarp, Brody groaned in his fevered sleep. Nell looked toward the south, toward the town. It felt like walking toward a cliff edge. It felt like walking back to the auction block. But as Caleb helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand firm on her waist, she realized the difference. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't empty. She touched the spot over her heart where his hand had rested the night before. There was a fire there now, a small, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished by fear or shame. Caleb climbed up beside her. He took the reins. He looked at her one last time, a silent promise passing between them. "Let us go," he said. He snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching on the frozen earth, carrying them toward the judgment of men and the fight for their lives. The wagon rolled down the main street of Dry Creek like a hearse, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding loudly against the hard-packed earth. Caleb sat on the bench, his posture rigid, the reins wrapped loosely around his leather-gloved hands. Beside him, Nell sat with her spine pressed against the wooden backrest, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She refused to look at the boardwalks, but she could feel the weight of the town's gaze pressing against her skin. They had brought Brody in the back, the wounded man groaning intermittently under the canvas tarp. The sound drew attention. Men stepped out of the saloon, wiping foam from their mustaches. Women paused in their sweeping, leaning on their brooms to watch the spectacle. It was not every day a woman rode into town with a man she had shot bleeding in her wagon. Caleb pulled the team to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. The building was brick, one of the few sturdy structures in town, with a heavy oak door that stood open. Sheriff Brady stepped out before the dust had even settled. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth and eyes that looked perpetually tired. He looked at Caleb, then at Nell, and finally at the shape under the canvas. "Is he dead?" Brady asked, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "He is alive," Caleb said, his voice flat, "but he needs the doctor." He took a rifle bullet to the shoulder. Brady nodded to a deputy standing in the doorway. "Get the doc, and get 2 men to carry him over there." The sheriff walked to the side of the wagon. He looked up at Nell. He didn't look angry, just resigned. "I have a warrant." "Miss Hart," Brady said, "sworn out this morning by Rex Mallory. Attempted murder." "It was self-defense," Caleb said, the anger vibrating in his tone like a plucked wire. "They rode onto my land. They attacked her. That is for the judge to decide," Brady said. "Judge Vance is in town on the circuit. Mallory is pushing for a hearing today." He reached up a hand toward Nell. "You have to come down, miss. I have to take you into custody." Nell looked at the sheriff's hand. It was broad and calloused. It looked like a hand that simply did what it was told. She felt the panic flutter in her throat, a trapped bird beating its wings against her ribs. She looked at Caleb. Caleb's jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked ready to draw the Colt at his hip, but he knew, and she knew, that if he drew on the sheriff, they would both be dead before they hit the ground. "Go with him," Caleb said softly. "I will be right there. I am not leaving you." Nell took a breath that tasted of dust and fear. She ignored the sheriff's hand and climbed down the wheel herself. Her boots hit the dirt with a solid thud. "I am ready," she said. The jail cell was small, smelling of lye soap, stale tobacco, and the sour reek of previous misery. It had 3 stone walls and 1 wall of iron bars facing the sheriff's desk. Brady locked the door with a heavy clank of metal on metal. The sound echoed in Nell's bones. She stood in the center of the cell, wrapping her arms around herself. The walls felt like they were closing in. The window was high and barred, letting in only a square of gray light. She was back in a cage. It didn't matter that it was the law. It felt exactly like the auction. She was a thing to be held, a thing to be judged. "Can I bring her a chair?" Caleb asked from the outer room. Brady grunted. "Do what you want. Rourke, just do not cause trouble." Caleb dragged a wooden chair to the front of the bars. He didn't sit. He stood there, gripping the iron with both hands, his face close to the gap. "Nell," he said. She turned to him. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown black with fear. "I can't breathe in here," she whispered. "Look at me," Caleb commanded gently. He waited until she met his gaze. His gray eyes were steady, an anchor in the rising tide of her panic. "You are not trapped," he said. "You are just waiting. This is just a room." "They are going to hang me," she said. "I saw the way they looked at us. They think I am a monster." "You are not a monster," Caleb said. "You are the woman who stood against a prairie fire and beat it into the dirt. You are the woman who hit a glass bottle at 50 yards. You are the strongest thing I know." He reached through the bars. His hand hung there, open and inviting. Nell hesitated, then stepped forward. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and solid. "We tell the truth," Caleb said. "That is all we do. We tell them exactly what happened. Mallory relies on lies. He relies on people being too scared to speak, but we are not scared. Not anymore." Nell held onto his hand as if it were a lifeline over a dark abyss. She closed her eyes and remembered the weight of the rifle, the kick against her shoulder. She hadn't fired out of malice. She had fired because she refused to be dragged back to the dark. "I am not scared," she lied. But as she said it, squeezing Caleb's hand, She felt a flicker of truth in the words. The hearing was convened 2 hours later in the makeshift courtroom above the general store. It was a long, stifling room used for town meetings and dances, now filled with rows of benches that groaned under the weight of half the town. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed wool, sweat, and anticipation. To the people of Dry Creek, this was better than a traveling circus. It was a scandal. The cowboy and his bought bride, facing down the most powerful man in the territory. Judge Vance sat behind a scarred oak table at the front of the room. He was a thin, severe man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a face that looked like it had been carved out of dried apple. He did not suffer fools, but he was known to drink with the wealthy when the gavel was down. Nell sat at a small table to the left, Caleb beside her. He sat close, his knee brushing hers, a constant reminder that she was not alone. Rex Mallory sat on the right. He looked relaxed, almost bored. He was cleaning his fingernails with a small penknife. Beside him sat a lawyer from the county seat, a man with slicked-back hair and a suit that cost more than Caleb's ranch. Judge Vance banged his gavel. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight cutting across the room. "We are here to examine the facts regarding the shooting of Mr. Thomas Brody," the judge announced. "The defendant, Eleanor Hart, claims self-defense. The plaintiff, Mr. Mallory, claims attempted murder and breach of contract." The first witness called was Silas Hart. Nell felt her stomach twist as her father walked to the front. He looked older than she remembered. His shoulders stooped. He avoided looking at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the judge, his hat crumpled in his hands. "Mr. Hart," the judge said, "tell us what happened at the Rourke Ranch." Silas licked his lips. He spoke in a voice that trembled with a practiced sorrow. "I only went to see my girl, Judge. I was worried about her. She had been taken from town under distress. I wanted to bring her home." "Taken?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir," Silas said, sniffing. "Mr. Rourke. He confused her. He turned her against her own flesh and blood. When we arrived, I tried to reason with her. I told her I forgave her. I told her Mr. Mallory was willing to be generous." He paused, wiping a tear that wasn't there. But she was wild. "Judge, like a fever was on her. Rourke had put a gun in her hand. When poor Mr. Brody tried to help her, tried to calm her down, she shot him, like it was sport." A murmur ran through the crowd. Like sport, a wild woman. Nell stared at her father. She waited for the hurt, the sting of betrayal that had defined her childhood. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a cold, distant pity. He was so small. He was a man who would sell his own blood for a bottle of whiskey and a pat on the head from a man like Mallory. Caleb's hand tightened on his knee. He was shaking with silent rage. Nell reached under the table and touched his wrist, calming him. "Next witness," the judge called. "Caleb Rourke." Caleb stood up. He walked to the front of the room. He didn't slouch, and he didn't fidget. He stood tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the window. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, "you claim you did not abduct Miss Hart?" "I did not," Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying to the back of the room without effort. "I bought a debt." "Explain," the judge said. "There was an auction," Caleb said, "in the saloon. Silas Hart put his daughter on a chair and asked for bids. He was selling her to cover his gambling markers." The crowd went quiet. Hearing it spoken aloud, in the daylight, made it sound uglier than it had in the whiskey-soaked dark of the saloon. "I paid $1,000 in gold." Caleb continued. "I paid it to free her. I told her she owed me nothing. She came to my ranch because she had nowhere else to go. She worked for wages. She had her own room." "And the shooting?" the judge asked. "I was not there," Caleb said. "But I know Nell. She does not shoot for sport. She shoots when she is cornered. If she pulled that trigger, it was because those men gave her no choice." Mallory's lawyer stood up. Objection. The witness is speculating. He admits he was absent. Sustained. The judge said. Step down. Mr. Rourke. Then... The bailiff called out the name Nell had been dreading. Eleanor Hart. Nell stood up. Her legs felt like water. The room seemed to tilt. She felt the eyes of every man and woman in the room crawling over her skin. She walked to the chair. She sat down. Miss Hart, the judge said, peering over his spectacles. Did you shoot Thomas Brodie? Yes, Nell said. Her voice was a whisper. Speak up, girl, the judge snapped. Yes, Nell said, louder this time. I shot him. Why? Because he grabbed me, Nell said. She looked out at the crowd. She saw the churchwomen judging her dress. She saw the men assessing her worth. And suddenly, the anger she had felt at the ranch returned. It burned through the shame. He grabbed me by the hair, Nell said, her voice gaining strength. He threw me against the wall. He told me I belonged to whoever was strongest. He said he was going to teach me manners. She looked at her father. My father brought them there. He stood in the yard and watched. He told them to put me on a horse. He told me I had been sold to Mr. Mallory and that I had to go back. She turned her eyes to Mallory. He was smirking, but the smirk faltered slightly under her gaze. I was sold, Nell said, like a cow, like a chair, in this town, in front of all of you. She gestured to the crowd. You were there, Mr. Miller. You bid $50. You were there. Mrs. Gable. Your husband told me about it. You all watched. The room was deathly silent. I am not a thing, Nell said. Her voice broke, then steadied. I am a human being. And when that man tried to drag me out of my home, I picked up a rifle and I stopped him. I did not do it for sport. I did it because I was done being sold. She stopped. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst. But she felt lighter. The secret was out. The shame wasn't hers anymore. She had taken it out of her heart and thrown it at their feet. The judge looked at her for a long moment. He cleared his throat. Mr. Mallory to the stand. Rex Mallory stood up, adjusting his cuffs. He walked to the chair with the air of a man indulging a child's game. Mr. Mallory, the judge said, did you authorize your men to go to the Rourke Ranch? I authorized Mr. Hart to retrieve his daughter, Mallory said smoothly. My men were simply there for protection. The roads are dangerous. Did you claim that Miss Hart was your property? The judge asked. Mallory chuckled. A figure of speech. Your Honor, Mr. Hart owed me a significant sum. He offered his daughter's hand in marriage as collateral. When Mr. Rourke interfered, he complicated the investment. Investment, the judge repeated. She is a valuable asset, Mallory said, shrugging. Beauty is a commodity. Judge, we are men of the world. We know this. From the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, stood up. He was wringing his hat in his hands, his face red. Your Honor? Henderson squeaked. Sit down. Henderson, Mallory snapped. Let him speak, the judge ordered. It was an auction. Judge, Henderson said, his voice trembling. I was there. Mallory bid $500. He said he liked them young and scared. He called it a purchase. Everyone heard it. Mallory's face went purple. He stood up. You shut your mouth, Henderson, or I will close you down. Sit down, Mr. Mallory, the judge roared, slamming his gavel. Mallory sat, but his eyes were murderous. The mood in the room had shifted. The townsfolk were still wary of Mallory, still fond of their gossip, but the naked ugliness of his words, commodity, investment, had soured the air. It was one thing to whisper about a fallen woman. It was another to openly endorse slavery in a Christian town. The judge looked at his notes. He looked at Silas, who was shrinking into his bench. He looked at Nell, who sat with her head high. Caleb's hand resting protectively on the back of her chair. "The court finds," the judge said, his voice dry and sharp, "that the shooting of Thomas Brody was an act of self-defense committed during an attempted kidnapping." Nell let out a breath she felt she had been holding for days. Caleb squeezed her shoulder hard. "Furthermore," the judge continued, glaring at Silas, "while the law in this territory is loose on matters of debt, it is quite clear on matters of flesh. Selling your child, Mr. Hart, is an abomination. If I hear of you trying to enforce this so-called contract again, I will have you thrown in the darkest hole in the territory. Case dismissed." The relief was dizzying, but as they walked out of the store and onto the boardwalk, the reality of their victory settled in. The crowd parted for them, but no one smiled. No one offered a hand. They stared with a mixture of curiosity and cold judgment. To them, Nell was still the woman who had been auctioned. She was still the woman who had shot a man. She was dangerous. She was tainted. Caleb guided her toward the wagon. His hand was on the small of her back, a shield against the eyes. Just as they reached the hitching post, Pike stepped out from the alley. He was alone, leaning against a post, cleaning his fingernails with a knife similar to Mallory's. He looked at Caleb, his lazy eye wandering. "You think you won, cowboy?" Pike sneered. Caleb stopped. He turned to face the man. "Get out of my way, Pike." Pike pushed off the post. He stepped into the street, his hand hovering near his gun. "You shot my partner," Pike said loud enough for the street to hear. "A woman doing a man's work, hiding behind her skirts. Are you Rourke?" Caleb felt the rage boil up in his chest. It would be so easy. He could see the twitch in Pike's shoulder. He could draw. He could put a bullet in this man's chest and end the threat right here. The memory of his sister, of his own helplessness back then, screamed at him to violence. Kill him! Make them afraid! But then he felt Nell's hand on his arm. "Caleb, don't!" she whispered. He looked at her. Her eyes were pleading, not out of fear for Pike, but out of fear for him. She didn't want him to be a killer. She didn't want their life to be built on blood. Caleb looked back at Pike. He saw the desperation in the gunman's eyes. Pike wanted a fight. He wanted to turn Caleb into a murderer, to justify whatever vengeance Mallory planned next. Caleb took a deep breath. He unbuckled his gun belt. The crowd gasped. Caleb wound the leather around the holster and tossed the rig into the wagon bed. "I am not fighting you, Pike," Caleb said calmly. "It is over." He turned his back on the gunman. It was the ultimate insult, and the ultimate act of trust. He helped Nell up into the wagon seat. Pike stood there, his hand on his gun, looking foolish. He couldn't shoot an unarmed man in the middle of the street, not with the judge still upstairs. He spat on the ground and turned away, disappearing back into the alley. Caleb climbed up beside Nell. He picked up the reins. "Let us go home," he said. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Nell watched the land roll by. It was just as beautiful, just as wild as it had been the day they arrived. But it looked different now. "Do you think it is over?" she asked softly. Caleb looked at the horizon. "No. Mallory is humiliated. A man like that does not let go. He will wait. He will cut fences. He will poison water. He will make sure no one buys my beef." He looked at her. "We can't stay here. Nell." Nell felt a sharp pang of grief. The ranch, the cabin, the garden she had started to plant. It was the first home she had ever felt safe in. "Where would we go?" she asked. "West," Caleb said. "Farther west. Oregon, maybe. Or California. There are new settlements, places where nobody knows us, where nobody knows about the auction." He shifted the reins to one hand and took hers. "We can sell the herd in the next county. We can pack the wagon. We can start over. A clean slate." Nell looked back at the darkening trail behind them. Leaving meant giving up the land. It meant giving up the security of the known. But staying meant living in the shadow of the auction block forever. It meant always waiting for the next dead rabbit on the fence post. She looked at Caleb. She looked at the man who had spent his fortune to free her, who had stood between her and the fire, who had refused to kill for pride. The ranch was just dirt and wood. Home was sitting right next to her. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. "Let us go." They spent the next day packing. It was a mournful, quiet work. They took only what would fit in the wagon. The rest, the heavy furniture, the plow, the tools, would have to be left behind. Nell packed the few dishes they had. She folded the quilts. She took the curtains down from the window, folding the yellow fabric with care. When the wagon was loaded, the sun was already low in the sky. Massive, dark clouds were gathering in the north, thick with the promise of a storm. The wind was picking up, whistling through the empty corrals with a lonely, hollow sound. Nell walked through the cabin one last time. It looked so small now, stripped of their life. It was just a shell. She touched the rough-hewn table where they had eaten their silent meals. She walked into the main room and stood by the bed. She remembered the night of the fire. She remembered the storm. She remembered the way Caleb had held her, as if she were precious. She felt a deep, aching sadness. She had found herself here. She had learned to shoot, to work, to love within these walls. But as she turned to the door, she felt a fierce optimism rising through the grief. She wasn't leaving herself behind. She was taking the strength she had found with her. Caleb was waiting by the wagon. He had hitched the team. He was checking the harness, but his eyes were scanning the ridge. He sensed it too. The time for leaving was now. Mallory wouldn't wait long. Nell walked out onto the porch. She closed the door. She didn't lock it. There was nothing left inside to steal. She walked down the steps and climbed onto the wagon seat. Caleb looked up at her. "You sure?" he asked. Nell looked at the ominous clouds rolling in, darker than night. She looked at the empty horizon. Then she looked at him. "I am sure," she said. Caleb climbed up. He released the brake. "Hey-ah!" The horses leaned into the collars. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels creaking under the load. They drove out of the gate and turned west, toward the mountains that were just jagged shadows against the dying light. They didn't look back at the town. They didn't look back at the cabin. They rode toward the dark clouds, toward the unknown, carrying nothing but a few sacks of flour, a rifle, and a love that had been forged in the fire of their survival. And behind them, on the wind, came the faint, distant sound of thunder, or perhaps the rumble of hoofbeats pursuing them into the night. The trail leading west from Dry Creek was not a road so much as a suggestion carved into the hard earth by the few wagons that had dared the journey before. The wind picked up as the sun climbed higher. No longer the steady breeze of the open plains, but a gusting, erratic force that funneled through the gaps in the rising hills. It carried the taste of dust and the metallic scent of distant rain. Caleb drove the team with a grim focus. Beside him, Nell watched the horizon change. The rolling grasslands gave way to a landscape that felt broken and reassembled by a violent hand. Rocky ridges jutted up like jagged teeth, and the trail wound through narrow passes where the shadows lay long and cold, even at midday. Dry riverbeds cut across their path, filled with tumbled stones that made the wagon groan and lurch, testing every bolt and beam of hickory. They spoke little. The silence between them was not the awkward emptiness of their first days together, nor the heavy fear of the trial. It was the companionable, vigilant silence of two soldiers moving through enemy territory. Nell kept the Winchester rifle resting across her knees, her fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the wooden stock. She did not need to be told to watch the rear. On the afternoon of the second day, the trail dipped into a hollow where a sod-roofed shack leaned against a hillside. It was a way station, half abandoned. run by an elderly couple named Elias and Martha, who looked as weathered and gray as the sagebrush surrounding their home. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the water trough. Elias hobbled out, squinting against the wind, wiping his hands on a rag. "You folks are pushing hard," Elias noted, his voice cracking like dry twigs. The horses look blown. "We are moving west," Caleb said, stepping down to check the team's hooves. "We have miles to make before dark." Elias spat into the dirt. "You might want to push harder. Or find a place to dig in." Caleb froze, his hand resting on the flank of the bay mare. "Why is that?" Caleb asked quietly. "Riders passed the ridge east of here about an hour ago," Elias said. "5 of them. They were not moving like men on a Sunday ride. They stopped to water their mounts at the creek, and I heard them talking. They asked about a wagon, asked about a man with a scar and a woman." Nell felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She looked back the way they had come. The land was empty, a vast quilt of brown and gray. But she knew the emptiness was a lie. "Did you tell them?" Nell asked. Martha, standing in the doorway with a shotgun cradled in her arm, shook her head. "We told them we had not seen a soul in 3 days. But men like that, they have eyes for tracks. They will find the wheel ruts soon enough." Caleb looked at Nell. He saw the flash of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by a steely resolve. "Thank you," Caleb said. He pressed a silver dollar into the old man's hand. They did not stay to rest. They watered the horses quickly, Caleb pouring the water over their heads to cool them, and climbed back onto the wagon. As they rolled out of the hollow, Caleb looked at the sky. The clouds were thickening, dark bellies dragging across the peaks of the distant mountains. "There is a canyon about 5 miles ahead," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Dead Man's Cut. The walls are steep. If we can make it there, they can't flank us. We can hold the wagon at the narrowest point." "And if they catch us before then?" Nell asked. Caleb snapped the reins, urging the tired horses into a trot. "Then we make our stand on the open ground. But I would rather have rock at my back." They pushed the horses hard. The wagon bounced violently over the uneven trail, the supplies in the back rattling like bones. Nell gripped the seat with one hand and the rifle with the other, her eyes watering from the wind and the dust. They were 2 miles from the canyon mouth when Nell saw them. "Behind us!" she shouted. Caleb looked back. On the crest of the ridge they had just descended. 5 silhouettes appeared against the gray sky. They paused for a second, then spurred their horses down the slope. Even at this distance, the intent was clear. They were not coming to talk. "Yeah!" Caleb yelled, slapping the reins. The wagon surged forward. The chase was brutal. The world narrowed down to the thunder of hooves, the creaking of wood, and the cloud of dust that choked the air. Nell watched the riders closing the distance. They were riding light, unencumbered by a load, gaining ground with every yard. She could see the lead rider now, the flash of a silver concho on a saddle, the dark shape of a coat flapping in the wind. Rex Mallory. "He hasn't given up," Nell shouted over the roar of the wheels. "He can't," Caleb yelled back. "His pride is worth more to him than his life." A gunshot cracked, a small, popping sound that was swallowed by the wind. A puff of dirt kicked up 10 feet to the left of the wagon. "Keep your head down," Caleb ordered. "I am not hiding," Nell shouted back. They careened around a bend, the wagon wheels lifting dangerously off the ground before slamming back down. Ahead, the earth opened up, a jagged slash of red rock and shadow. The canyon. "Almost there," Caleb shouted. Another shot rang out, closer this time. It splintered the wood of the tailgate. They tore into the mouth of the canyon. The walls rose up instantly, sheer cliffs of sandstone that blocked out the sun. The trail narrowed, littered with fallen boulders. Caleb hauled on the reins, dragging the horses to a sliding halt where the passage was tightest. He set the brake and jumped down. "Get behind the wheels," Caleb commanded. He began to unhitch the horses, slapping their rumps to send them further down the canyon, out of the line of fire. He needed the wagon as a barricade. Nell scrambled down, clutching the rifle and a box of cartridges. She took a position behind the rear wheel, using the heavy oak spokes as cover. Caleb grabbed his own rifle and slid into position beside the front wheel. He looked at her. His face was streaked with sweat and dust, his eyes wild with adrenaline and fear. "Nell, listen to me," he hissed. "When the shooting starts, stay low. If they overrun us, you run. You run into the rocks and you don't look back." "No," Nell said. Her voice was shaking, but the word was hard as iron. Caleb grabbed her arm. "Do not argue with me. I can hold them off long enough for you to—" "You told me I wasn't helpless," Nell yelled back, her eyes locking onto his. "You told me I wasn't a thing to be protected and sold. I am your partner. Caleb, I stay." They stared at each other for a heartbeat, the fierce whisper of their argument cutting through the echo of approaching hoofbeats. In that look, there was terror. Yes, but beneath the terror was a love so desperate and consuming it felt like it could crack the canyon walls. He wanted to save her. She wanted to save him. Neither would accept a world without the other. Caleb let go of her arm. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, then aimed true. He said. The riders slowed as they entered the canyon. They knew the terrain had shifted against them. They fanned out, their horses dancing nervously on the loose stones. Rex Mallory rode in the center. He wore a long duster and a flat-brimmed hat. Flanking him were 4 men, rough, hired guns who looked more like bandits than cowboys. Mallory stopped his horse 30 yards away. The canyon amplified his voice, turning it into a booming echo. "End of the line. Rourke!" Mallory shouted. Caleb rested the barrel of his rifle on the wagon seat. "Turn around, Mallory!" Caleb called out. "There is nothing for you here but a long walk home." "You have something of mine," Mallory said. He didn't draw his gun yet. He sat tall in the saddle, arrogant to the last. "That girl belongs to me. She is lost property. I am just here to collect on a debt. She belongs to no one." Caleb roared. The sound tore from his throat, raw and primal. "She is free, and I would rather die right here on this rock than watch another man put a hand on her." Behind the wheel. Nell felt the words hit her like a physical blow. A fierce, painful tenderness welled up in her chest, mixing with the adrenaline. He wasn't just defending her life, he was defending her soul. Mallory laughed, a cold, dry sound. "Then you will die, cowboy! Boys!" The canyon exploded into noise. Mallory's men opened fire. Bullets hammered against the wagon, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Caleb returned fire instantly, the boom of his buffalo rifle echoing like thunder. Nell pressed her cheek against the stock of the Winchester. She saw a muzzle flash from behind a boulder where one of the men had taken cover. She fired. The dirt kicked up near his boot, forcing him back. "Keep their heads down," Caleb shouted, working the lever of his rifle. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of cordite. A bullet whined off the metal rim of the wheel inches from Nell's face, dusting her with lead fragments. She flinched but didn't freeze. She jacked another round into the chamber. Suddenly, Caleb grunted. It was a wet, sharp sound. He buckled, dropping to one knee. "Caleb!" Nell screamed. "I'm all right," he gasped. He clutched his left thigh. Blood was already dark on his trousers. "Just a graze. Keep shooting." But the rhythm of the fight had changed. Seeing Caleb hit, one of Mallory's men saw an opening. He spurred his horse, breaking from cover and riding hard up the sloping canyon wall, trying to circle behind the wagon. "He is flanking us," Caleb yelled, trying to turn. But his leg gave out and he slipped in the gravel. The rider reached the high ground behind them. He raised his pistol, aiming directly at Caleb's exposed back. Nell saw him. Time seemed to stop. The noise of the canyon faded into a dull roar. All she could hear was her own heartbeat and Caleb's voice in her memory. Steady breath, firm stance. eyes open. She didn't think about the man. She didn't think about sin or judgment. She thought about the man kneeling in the dirt who had given her a room with a lock. She swung the rifle around. She rose to her knees, exposing herself to fire from the front. She didn't care. She exhaled. She squeezed. The rifle kicked hard. The rider on the slope jerked backward. His arms flew out. He tumbled from the saddle, sliding down the shale in a cloud of dust, coming to rest still and silent at the bottom. Nell racked the lever again, breathing hard. The shock of it rolled through her, the realization that she had taken a life. But unlike the shame of the auction, unlike the fear of the trial, this felt different. She felt fierce. She felt desperate. She felt alive. She had drawn a line in the dust, and she had defended it. The fall of the rider shifted the air in the canyon. Mallory's remaining 3 men stopped firing. They looked at the body on the slope. They looked at the wagon, where a woman was standing with a smoking rifle and a look of absolute, terrifying resolve. "This isn't worth $50, one of them shouted. He wheeled his horse around. "Get back here," Mallory screamed. "I am paying you to fight." "Not against that," the man yelled back. He spurred his horse and galloped back toward the canyon mouth. The other 2 hesitated only a second before following him. They were hired guns, not soldiers. They knew when a job had gone bad. Mallory was left alone. He sat on his horse, his face twisting with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He looked at Caleb, who was struggling back to his feet, leaning on the wagon wheel. He looked at Nell. "You ruined everything," Mallory hissed. He raised his gun, leveling it at Caleb. He didn't care about the money anymore. He just wanted to break the thing that had defied him. Caleb didn't have his rifle. It had fallen in the dirt when he went down. But he didn't dive for cover, fueled by the memory of his sister burning in a house he couldn't open, fueled by the image of Nell sitting in that chair with dead eyes. Caleb moved. He lunged forward, ignoring the pain in his leg. Mallory fired. The bullet tore through the fabric of Caleb's coat, missing skin by inches. Before Mallory could cock the hammer again, Caleb grabbed the bridle of his horse, jerking the animal's head down. The horse reared. Mallory lost his seat, tumbling backward into the dust. Caleb was on him before he could rise. It was a raw, brutal fight. There was no technique, only desperation. They rolled in the dirt, grappling for the gun. Mallory struck Caleb in the face, splitting his lip. Caleb responded with a hook to the ribs that drove the air from Mallory's lungs. Caleb wrenched the pistol from Mallory's grip and tossed it away. He grabbed Mallory by the lapels of his expensive coat and hauled him up, slamming him back against the canyon wall. Caleb drew his own revolver from his holster. He pressed the cold barrel against Mallory's forehead. Mallory froze. His eyes were wide, staring into the black bore of the gun. He was panting, bleeding from the nose, stripped of all his power. "Do it," Mallory wheezed. "Show her what kind of animal you are." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. The rage was a screaming thing in his blood. It would be so easy. It would be justice. Nell watched. She didn't look away. She didn't scream for him to stop. She held her rifle, waiting, trusting him to make the choice. Caleb looked at Mallory. He saw a small, petty man who thought owning people made him a god, if he killed him. Caleb realized he was just another violent man in a violent land. He would be feeding the same cycle that had killed his father, his sister, and nearly destroyed Nell. Slowly, Caleb lowered the hammer. He pulled the gun back. "No," Caleb said. His voice was cold and hard as the canyon rock. "I am not you." He stepped back. "Strip," Caleb ordered. Mallory blinked. "What? Your gun belt? Your coat? Your boots? Take them off." Mallory stared at him, hatred burning in his eyes. But he saw that Caleb was not bluffing. Slowly, with trembling hands, he unbuckled his gun belt. He took off his duster. He pulled off his fine leather boots. "Start walking," Caleb said, pointing back toward the canyon mouth. "Without a horse?" Mallory demanded. "It is 20 miles to town." "Then you better start now," Caleb said. Humiliated, barefoot, and stripped of his weapons, Rex Mallory looked small. The wild land didn't care about his money. The rocks would cut his feet, just as they would any other man's. He was just a man now, subject to the same harsh laws of nature as everyone else. Mallory spat on the ground, turned, and began to limp away over the sharp stones. He didn't look back. As Mallory disappeared around the bend, the strength finally left Caleb's legs. He collapsed beside the wagon wheel, his back sliding down the wood until he hit the dirt. He gasped, clutching his bleeding leg. Nell dropped the rifle. She fell to her knees beside him. "Caleb!" She tore the hem of her petticoat, ripping the fabric into strips. She pressed the cloth against the wound on his thigh. The blood was bright red, but the flow was slowing. "I am okay," Caleb groaned, his head falling back against the wheel. It went through the meat, no bone. Nell's hands were shaking as she bound the wound. Tears were streaming down her face now, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. They mingled with the blood on his skin. "You idiot," she sobbed. "You stubborn, foolish idiot. You could have been killed." Caleb reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were shining. "You saved me," he whispered. Nell looked at him. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. They breathed together, inhaling the dust and the sweat and the smell of their own survival. In that moment, under the vast, uncaring sky, the last walls between them crumbled. "I was so scared," Nell confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared you would leave me alone. I am never leaving you." Caleb said, "I love you, Nell. I love you more than I have ever loved anything on this earth." "I love you," she whispered back. It wasn't a poetic declaration. It was a jagged, desperate truth, forged in gunfire and blood. It was a love as wild and unstoppable as the land itself. They limped onward. It took them another week to cross the mountains. They moved slowly, letting Caleb's leg heal, letting the horses recover. When they finally crested the last pass, the land below opened up like a promise. It was the valley they had heard rumors of. It was a sheltered stretch of green, fed by a clear, rushing stream that tumbled down from the snowpack. Dark pines stood like sentries along the rim, protecting the basin from the harshest winds. Smoke curled from the chimneys of 3 or 4 cabins scattered across the valley floor. It was a new settlement, small but sturdy. As they drove the wagon down into the valley, people came out to meet them. They were hard-looking people, men and women with calloused hands and weary faces. But their eyes were kind. They didn't ask where they had come from. They didn't ask about the bandage on Caleb's leg. They saw a wagon loaded with tools and 2 people willing to work. "Welcome," a woman with a sunbonnet said, handing Nell a ladle of fresh water. "There is good land by the South Fork." Months passed in a blur of hard work and healing. The montage of their life began to build. Frame by frame, they built a cabin, not a shack like Silas Hart's, but a home. The neighbors came, a Swedish family, a former soldier, a widow with 3 sons, and helped raise the walls. Caleb paid them in labor, his legs stiff but strong as he worked cattle on the lush green pasture of the valley floor. Nell planted a garden. She coaxed beans and squash from the dark earth. She learned the rhythms of this new place. She was no longer the girl who carried water with her head down. She walked with her chin up. One afternoon, Nell stood by the fence with the neighbor's daughter, a shy girl of 12 named Clara. Nell held the Winchester, feet apart. Nell said gently, adjusting the girl's stance, "Lean into it. You are not helpless. Clara, remember that. The gun is just a tool. The strength comes from you." She watched as the girl fired, hitting the target. Nell smiled. She was determined that no girl in this valley would ever grow up feeling like she had to wait for someone to save her. Autumn turned the aspens to gold. One morning, as the frost lay heavy on the grass, Nell realized she had missed her bleeding time for 2 months. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on her stomach. The news terrified her. The world was still hard. Winters were cold. Children died. But then she remembered the auction. She remembered the fire. She remembered the canyon. She wasn't bringing a child into a trap. She was bringing a child into a life she had chosen. She told Caleb that evening in the barn. He was brushing the bay mare. He stopped, the brush mid-stroke. He turned to her, his eyes widening. "A baby?" he asked. Nell nodded. Caleb dropped the brush. He crossed the stall in 2 strides and swept her up, spinning her around, burying his face in her neck. When he set her down, his eyes were shining with tears. "This child will never know a chain," Caleb promised, his voice thick. "They will never doubt what they are worth. Not for a second." Winter came, settling over the valley in a blanket of white silence. One cold evening, the fire was roaring in the stone hearth. Caleb sat in the rocking chair, whittling a toy horse from a piece of pine. Nell sat on the rug at his feet, her head resting on his knee. She watched the flames dancing. "I still dream about it sometimes," she said softly. Caleb stopped whittling. "About the canyon?" "No," Nell said. "The auction. I can hear the men shouting. I can feel the hands on my arm. I wake up thinking I'm still in that chair." Caleb reached down. He took her hand, turning it over to expose the palm. He traced the faint white scars from where the water bucket handle had bitten into her skin all those years ago. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to the center of her palm. "Nell," he said quietly, "that night, I spent every dime I had. People thought I was crazy." He looked into the fire. "But the truth is, I didn't just buy your freedom. When I saw you sitting there, I saw a chance to stand between cruelty and someone who deserved better. I bought my own redemption. Nell, you saved me just as much as I saved you." Nell looked up at him. The firelight painted his face in golden shadow, softening the sharp angles, hiding the old scars. They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, the silence of the cabin wrapping around them like a warm quilt. The desire that pulsed between them wasn't the frantic, desperate need of the run. It was deep. It was enduring. It was a hunger tied to the life they had built, board by board, day by day. The story closed with them stepping outside. The night air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine resin and snow. The sky was a vast dome of indigo, scattered with stars that glittered like diamonds on black velvet. They walked to the edge of the porch. The valley was dark and peaceful, the only light coming from the distant windows of their neighbors. Nell rested a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the small, secret flutter of life inside. Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against his side to ward off the chill. Nell looked up at the stars. They looked the same as they had over Dry Creek, but they didn't feel indifferent anymore. They felt like witnesses to a miracle. "I am no one's property," she whispered to the night. "Not even yours." Caleb tightened his hold on her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No," he agreed, his voice a warm rumble against her ear. "You are my partner. You are my equal. You are my heart." The wild western night stretched around them, huge and unforgiving and beautiful, but it was no longer a cage. It was a horizon. It was a vast, shared future, waiting for them to walk into it together. Thank you for journeying with me through the dust and the danger of Nell and Caleb's story. It has been a pleasure to spin this yarn for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment and share your location. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. For more tales of the frontier, I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending in English. I read everyone. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.